I used to think every family was like mine, that parents naturally played favorites. I remember the first time I noticed how often my mother praised my sister while ignoring me. I was about 9, she was 7. She was adopted from a neighbor who couldn't take care of her, and we'd grown up with that story. My parents always made it clear it was our responsibility to make her feel loved. Of course, I tried. I gave up toys, snacks, and even time with friends if my sister got upset. She was never overtly malicious, but she always seemed to be pulling the spotlight. My parents encouraged me to accommodate her every whim, reminding me that she had come from a difficult situation. I never really resented her for it at the time. I just thought that was how siblings worked. Yet, as I got older, I started seeing how my parents would downplay any of my achievements but celebrate hers to an almost ridiculous degree. If I scored high on a test, they'd say, "That's nice." If she scored slightly lower, they'd reward her with a night out. It was like living in a house where the rules of fairness never quite existed. By the time I reached high school, it became clear that my own aspirations meant nothing compared to my sister's potential. I had dreams of starting a small craft business because I loved creating custom jewelry. But whenever I mentioned my passion, my parents would wave it off. They said I should focus on something more traditional. Meanwhile, my sister wanted to try painting, singing, dancing, and even horse riding. Each time she expressed a fleeting interest, my parents threw money at lessons, equipment, and private coaches. They told me I didn't need extra support because I was capable on my own. It made me feel invisible. After a while, I stopped talking about my goals around them. I figured I'd just do what I needed to do without their approval or involvement. When I was 16, I used my allowance to buy materials for homemade earrings and necklaces. I sold them to classmates and people in my neighborhood. It wasn't much, but I was proud of it. My sister saw me working hard, but never showed any real interest. My parents, on the other hand, noticed only enough to tell me that I was wasting time I could spend studying for college. During my senior year, I applied for scholarships without telling my parents. I managed to get a partial scholarship to a business program out of state. When I finally informed them, my dad shrugged and said he guessed it was good news. My mom asked why I wouldn't just stay local so I could help out at home. My sister was only 2 years behind me, so maybe I could guide her. That made no sense to me. I wanted my own path. I wanted to break free from the environment that had stifled me for years. Eventually, my parents relented and let me move. At college, I threw myself into every business-related opportunity. I attended seminars, networked with local entrepreneurs, and did side gigs to support myself. I also kept designing jewelry, expanding my repertoire into accessories that appealed to students on campus. While my sister continued bouncing from one interest to another, I was laser-focused on building a future for myself. My parents rarely called to check on me, and when they did, it was mostly to complain about how my sister needed new art supplies or private tutors. I learned to tune them out. After graduation, I moved to a city with a decent market for handmade crafts. I worked in retail to pay rent while saving up for my own venture. Slowly, I built a small online following for my jewelry and accessories. My parents never once congratulated me. They were more concerned about my sister's new plan to become a fashion designer. She'd apparently tried painting, sculpting, singing, and even baking before. Nothing stuck. I tried not to judge her, but it was frustrating seeing my parents invest thousands into her brand new sewing machines and design software while acting like my own business was just a hobby. Still, I kept my head down. Within a couple of years, my online store was bringing in enough revenue for me to lease a small space. It was a modest storefront, but it was all mine. I took out a loan to renovate it, turning it into a cozy boutique that showcased not just my creations, but also curated items from local artisans. I was proud of how far I'd come. That's when my parents suddenly took an interest. They called, praising my accomplishments like they'd been supportive all along. My sister chimed in too, claiming she'd inspired me. I decided to host a grand opening for my boutique. I saved the date, sent out invitations to friends, colleagues, and even local press. This was the culmination of years of hard work, and I wanted everyone to see it. About a week before the event, my parents phoned me. They said my sister was graduating from an accelerated program in fashion design on the same weekend, and they thought it would be wonderful if I combined my boutique opening with her graduation party. They acted like it was a brilliant idea, a 2-for-1 celebration, showcasing both their daughters' successes. I was appalled. They hadn't lifted a finger to support me financially or emotionally all these years, and now they wanted me to share my big day with an event all about my sister? They didn't even bother asking how I felt about it. They simply informed me that it would be more efficient to do it together, since relatives could visit from out of town just once. It was absurd. I politely told them no. My mother got offended and said I was being selfish. My father muttered that I'd regret excluding my sister. I decided not to budge. They showed up anyway, unannounced, on the day of my grand opening. I saw them walk in with my sister, who was wearing a sash that said "Graduate" in giant letters. She also wore a ridiculous tiara, as if the entire event was centered around her. My parents started going up to my guests, telling them how proud they were of their newly graduated daughter, basically hijacking my opening. A few of my friends looked at me sympathetically, noticing how uncomfortable it was. I tried to maintain my composure. I gave my speech, cut the ribbon, and thanked everyone for coming. My sister kept stepping in front of me whenever pictures were being taken, forcing her way into photos that were meant to feature me and my staff. My parents handed out little flyers for her portfolio website, overshadowing the business cards I had painstakingly prepared. By the end of the night, I felt like my event had been tainted by their intrusion. My sister even had the nerve to suggest we do a joint after-party, focusing more on her graduation. She said it loud enough for the crowd to hear, so I couldn't just brush her off without looking rude. It was humiliating. That night, I sat down and realized I'd spent my entire life being overshadowed by my sister with my parents' full support. I'd tried to be the bigger person, to stay polite and focus on my own goals, but they kept barging in, expecting me to share every milestone. Something in me snapped. I decided I wouldn't let them trample over my achievements anymore. I started planning a form of payback, something that would make them understand the gravity of their actions. But I knew it had to be more than just a petty argument or cutting them out of my life. I wanted to show them that I wasn't going to bend to their demands. I also wanted to protect my business. If they felt entitled now, they would only get worse once I started expanding. My sister was already looking for ways to profit from my store's traffic, hinting that she could showcase her designs there. My parents kept suggesting we do collaborations. I played nice at first, pretending I might consider it. Meanwhile, I took steps to secure my shop legally, making sure they couldn't claim any involvement. Then, I waited for the perfect opportunity. My sister announced she was hosting a fashion showcase to celebrate her graduation. She planned to rent a fancy space, invite local influencers, and debut her line of clothing. She had no real experience, but my parents were pushing her to go all out. They told her she could use my boutique as an overflow space for her designs. She called me, sounding almost giddy, and declared that we'd be working together on her big launch. I played along. I congratulated her, said I'd love to help, and offered to meet with her about the specifics. My sister was thrilled. She envisioned mannequins with her garments displayed in my store window. I told her it sounded great, but that we'd need a formal partnership agreement. She was confused but didn't question it too much, probably thinking it was just a small detail. I made sure to include clauses that protected my store's brand, stating that any promotional materials using my boutique's name would require my written approval. She signed without reading closely, dismissing it as boring legal stuff. My parents, of course, didn't care about the fine print either. They were too busy bragging about how their daughters were collaborating. Over the next month, I watched my sister and parents throw themselves into the showcase. They poured money into marketing materials, flyers, online ads, and a flashy website featuring my sister's name. My sister posted on social media about her debut, constantly tagging my store as if it was just an extension of her brand. She never once consulted me on any decisions, even though we'd agreed that all promotional content needed my sign-off. Whenever I asked to see what she was doing, she brushed me off, saying it was no big deal. The day before her showcase, I finally confronted her. I reminded her of the agreement and said I needed to approve the materials. She scoffed, telling me I was being paranoid. She claimed she had the right to market however she pleased. That was all I needed. I pulled out the contract she'd signed, pointing to the section requiring my written authorization for any mention of my boutique. She panicked. My parents tried to intervene, accusing me of sabotaging my sister's special moment, but they couldn't argue with the paperwork. I told them they could still hold the event, but they wouldn't be allowed to use my store's name or space. They thought I was bluffing, but I was dead serious. I sent them a cease and desist letter through a lawyer friend I'd made in college just to make it official. My parents were livid, calling me a traitor to the family. My sister sobbed that I was ruining her debut. They tried to scramble for a new venue, but all their marketing materials had my store's name splashed across them. They couldn't reprint everything in time. Many of the influencers they'd invited were expecting to see my boutique as part of the showcase. Without it, the event lost most of its appeal. On social media, confusion spread because people weren't sure where to go. Some even messaged me directly, asking if the showcase had been canceled. I calmly explained that my sister was not affiliated with my store. The day of her event arrived, and it was a flop. Only a handful of people showed up. The organizers of the rented space demanded extra fees for last-minute changes to the schedule. My parents had to foot the bill. My sister left in tears, humiliated by how poorly things went. I admit I felt a grim satisfaction. Of course, the fallout didn't end there. My parents tried to guilt-trip me afterward, saying I had embarrassed the family in front of everyone. They claimed I should have just let my sister use my boutique for her show because it would have been a win-win. I reminded them that they had never supported my business until they needed it for their own gain. They argued that they had raised me, so I owed them. I told them I didn't owe them anything. They threatened to cut me off completely, but I just laughed. They had never given me financial help anyway. My sister sent me angry messages, calling me heartless. She said she had always admired me, and this was how I repaid her. I knew she was just trying to save face because her big event had flopped. I didn't feel one bit of remorse. I was done being the doormat. After a few days, my mother showed up at my boutique unexpectedly, trying to broker a truce. She wanted me to meet them halfway, maybe do a joint event in the future. I told her flat out that I was finished with compromises. If my sister wanted to stand on her own 2 feet, she'd have to do it without my help. That's when my mom snapped, calling me ungrateful and saying I would die lonely without family. I asked her to leave. For the first time in my life, I felt fully in control. In the weeks that followed, I focused on growing my boutique. Word spread about the drama with my family, and to my surprise, people sympathized with me. Some of my regular customers said they were proud to support a small business owner who stood up for herself. Local crafters approached me, asking to feature their work in my shop. My sales increased, and I used the extra revenue to pay off part of my renovation loan. Meanwhile, my sister's online presence went quiet. She posted a few bitter messages about how some people couldn't stand to see her succeed, but she never named me directly. My parents tried once more to contact me, this time via email. They said they wanted to come to an understanding. They suggested that if I gave my sister a second chance, we could be a happy family again. I ignored their plea. I had spent too many years living under their manipulations, and I saw no reason to expose myself to that toxicity anymore. My friends noticed a change in me. I started smiling more, feeling genuine excitement about my future. I realized that cutting off the emotional leeches in my life had done wonders. With each passing day, I became more confident that I'd made the right decision. My store's reputation grew in our community, and even a few influencers reached out to collaborate with me instead of my sister. It felt like life was finally rewarding me for standing my ground. One afternoon, I received a letter from my parents. It wasn't an apology, but a demand. They insisted that I help pay for my sister's debts from her failed showcase, arguing that I was partly responsible for its downfall. They threatened to take legal action if I refused. I almost laughed out loud. They had no legal standing. My sister had signed a contract that explicitly prevented her from using my name or resources without permission. The showcase's failure was her own doing. I threw the letter away and blocked their numbers. After that, they started posting passive-aggressive comments on social media, insinuating that I was a cruel daughter who'd abandoned her family. I refused to engage. Meanwhile, my business continued thriving. I reinvested profits, expanded my inventory, and built stronger connections with fellow artisans. I also found real friends who appreciated me for who I was, not just for what I could provide. As my success grew, I prepared for the next potential ambush. My sister was still out there, presumably plotting her comeback or finding a new dream to chase. My parents would undoubtedly try to latch onto me again if they saw an opening. I made it a point to keep my personal life private, limiting what I shared online. Whenever I heard rumors about them seeking reconciliation, I brushed it off. I wasn't looking for peace with people who had repeatedly disregarded my boundaries and exploited my achievements. My revenge was thriving without them. A year later, my boutique was booming, and I'd opened a second location in a nearby town. I never invited my parents or sister to see it. They found out through social media and tried to get in touch, but I ignored their messages. I heard from mutual acquaintances that my sister was floundering again, unable to secure stable work. My parents apparently wanted me to hire her as a designer. Of course, I refused. I never forgave them. In my mind, they sealed their fate when they tried to hijack my achievements for her graduation. I dedicated every ounce of energy to building a life for myself, one that didn't include their toxic demands. Some relatives argued I was being harsh, but they didn't live through the years of favoritism and neglect. They didn't stand on that grand opening day watching my sister steal the show. So I feel no guilt. My success is mine alone, earned through sweat and resilience. If my parents and sister can't accept that, it's not my problem. I found happiness in independence, in owning something that belongs to me and me alone. That is the legacy I choose, not the one they tried to impose. My revenge isn't flashy or dramatic. It's simply living without their shadow hovering over me, thriving on my own terms, and knowing they can't take away what I've built. For me, that's more than enough. I will never forgive them, only prevail. I never imagined my own mother would betray me at the worst possible time, but that's exactly what happened. My parents got divorced when I was 9, and I lived mostly with my dad for years. My relationship with my mother was cordial at best, but we never really had a close bond. It wasn't that she was cruel from the start. She just always seemed more concerned with herself than anything else. When I turned 17, she remarried a man who already had 2 children a few years younger than me. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I was looking forward to starting college soon, and I figured her new life wouldn't affect me too directly. Then my dad got sick. It happened fast. One day, he was driving me around town to shop for dorm room essentials, and the next month, he was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to all sorts of machines. I couldn't process it. We were told he had a rare form of cancer, and despite every attempt by the doctors, nothing seemed to work. I was with him almost every day, skipping classes and putting my life on hold so I could be by his side. Watching him wither away was the hardest thing I'd ever done. His final wish was that I make peace with my mother, but I never promised I'd do that. I was there when he passed, holding his hand. I still remember the exact moment his eyes drifted shut and how my entire world tilted. After the funeral, I got a call from my mother's new husband. He told me they were redecorating the house I'd grown up in. I wasn't entirely sure why they felt they had the right to do that, but I figured maybe Mom wanted to change things around to start fresh. I wasn't living there anymore, so I didn't see the harm in letting them repaint or rearrange furniture. But I told him specifically that my room needed to stay untouched, at least until I had a chance to move my personal belongings. I'd inherited a few sentimental items from Dad, but most of my old clothes, books, and photos were still at Mom's house. He gave me a non-committal grunt in response, which didn't exactly reassure me. I was still numb from losing my dad, so I didn't push it. The next day, I went back to campus to finalize some paperwork. I was drained emotionally, and the last thing I wanted was a confrontation with my mother. Part of me secretly hoped that maybe this time she would behave decently. Maybe my dad's passing would soften her heart. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. She'd always been more interested in appearances and pleasing whoever she was with at the time. The following week, I found out just how wrong I was to trust her at all. I got a frantic phone call from a friend who lived across the street from my mother. She said she'd seen strangers hauling boxes out of the house and loading them into a van. My friend recognized some of the boxes. They had my name scribbled on them. When she asked what was happening, she was told that these items were being sold to make space for the new kids. My friend was so confused because she knew I hadn't asked anyone to sell my things. She tried to call me immediately, but I missed her call at first. When I finally listened to her voicemail, my heart dropped. She said she was sorry if she was overstepping, but she thought I should know that all my possessions were being carted away by a bunch of people she'd never seen before. I jumped in my car and drove straight to my mother's house, ignoring every speed limit sign on the way. The betrayal felt like a gut punch, especially coming so soon after my dad's funeral. By the time I got there, the van was gone. My mother greeted me at the door with the same artificially sweet smile I'd come to despise. She didn't even try to hide what she had done. She told me it was for the best, that I didn't really need all that junk, and it was time to let go of the past. I was too shocked to speak at first. I demanded she tell me where she'd taken my belongings, but she shrugged and said she'd sold them all. She claimed she needed the money to redecorate the house so her stepkids could have rooms that fit their tastes. I couldn't believe it. This was everything I had left from my childhood: yearbooks, gifts, sentimental trinkets, and a few valuable collectibles my dad had given me over the years. She sold them without even asking, all to cater to her new husband's kids who hardly even knew me. I felt something inside me snap. I told her that she had no right to sell anything that belonged to me, especially not after Dad's funeral. She acted like I was being dramatic, saying I should be focusing on my future instead of clinging to old stuff. Her husband appeared behind her, nodding in agreement. The two of them stood there like a united front of smug entitlement. The stepkids hovered in the background, looking bored. They didn't even seem interested in the drama. I wanted to scream. Instead, I told my mother I was done. Then I stormed out. I sat in my car, shaking with anger, mourning the items I'd never get back. It felt like a final severing of whatever little bond we had left. I didn't want to see her face again. Little did I know that soon she would regret every single decision she'd made that day. A few days later, I was contacted by Dad's lawyer. I was sure it was something related to funeral expenses or small details about his estate. The lawyer was a kind older man who invited me to his office. I walked in, still feeling the weight of my grief. He sat me down and told me my father had left a will. My eyes filled with tears because I didn't even know he'd had the time or foresight to do that. But Dad was always meticulous. It didn't surprise me that he had planned for every eventuality, even his own passing. The lawyer explained that my dad left me the house, the same house my mother was living in with her new family. I nearly fell off my chair. As far as I knew, the house was in both my parents' names. But apparently, when they got divorced, Dad negotiated to buy out her share to ensure I'd have a stable place to grow up in. The agreement let her stay there as long as she wanted. But upon Dad's death, ownership transferred fully to me. The will was crystal clear about it. I was stunned. The lawyer handed me the documents and my name was right there, listed as the sole beneficiary. I asked him if my mother knew, and he said she had been informed but didn't believe it at first. He also added that if she refused to vacate, I might have to take legal action. My anger from the betrayal at my dad's funeral flared up again, but this time it was mixed with a sense of grim satisfaction. I had leverage now. I went home and thought about my next move. My mother had effectively stolen from me by selling my belongings. She didn't give me a cent from that sale, and she hadn't even apologized. She made it clear she didn't care about my feelings, only about pleasing her new husband and stepchildren. My father must have known, on some level, that she was toxic. That's probably why he arranged for me to inherit the house outright. I didn't want to stoop to her level, but I also couldn't just let her walk all over me again. I decided to pay her a visit the next day, documents in hand. When she saw me, she rolled her eyes, as if my presence was a burden. Her new husband lurked around the corner, probably expecting me to start another shouting match. But I didn't shout. I calmly took out the papers and laid out the terms. The house was mine now. If they wanted to live there, they'd have to pay me rent at a fair market rate. If they couldn't afford it or refused, they'd have to leave. I also mentioned I knew she had sold my belongings, and I'd be considering legal action if she didn't comply with my terms. She stared at me in disbelief, her mouth flapping open like a fish out of water. Her husband turned beet red and insisted I had no right to disrupt their home. But I did have that right. Legally, it was now my property. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. It was the house I'd grown up in, and I'd always imagined it as my safe haven. Evicting my own mother felt surreal, almost heartless. But then I remembered how she'd sold my memories. I thought about my father, whose dying wish was for me to have security. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about standing up for myself and respecting Dad's final gift to me. They screamed and yelled, threatened to call the cops. I told them to go ahead because I'd be happy to show the cops the legal documents proving my ownership. My mother then tried a different tactic. She burst into tears, pleading with me to reconsider, saying they'd be on the street and that her stepchildren would suffer. She begged me to be reasonable, but I refused to back down. She had a job, her husband had a job, and they could certainly find a smaller place if they couldn't afford my rent. I wasn't about to subsidize the people who had stolen my possessions and disrespected me in my time of grief. She started ranting about how Dad never cared about her and how she deserved the house for putting up with him all those years. That was the last straw. I told her she had 1 month to decide, pay rent or move out. Then I left, ignoring her wailing as I walked out the door. I spent the next few weeks focusing on college and trying to piece my life back together. Every so often, I'd get a barrage of texts and phone calls from my mother or her husband. Sometimes they'd threaten me. Other times they'd try to guilt trip me by saying the stepkids were having a hard time at school. I didn't respond. I had made my terms clear. Meanwhile, I looked into whether I'd have any legal recourse to recover damages for the items they sold. It turned out I'd have a strong case, but it might get complicated since I'd need to prove their value. Still, the possibility was there. My mother missed the first rent payment deadline. I sent a formal notice, reminding her of our agreement. She responded with an angry voicemail about how I was an ungrateful child. She played the victim, pretending she hadn't done anything wrong. I saved the voicemail, just in case it could be useful later. My lawyer said these messages might help paint a picture of her hostility if we ended up in a court battle. About a month after I'd laid down the law, I got a text from my mother. She said they would pay the rent but needed more time. She asked if I'd be willing to lower the amount. I refused because I'd based my figure on local rental rates, which was already generous. In truth, I'd have been happier if she moved out and gave me a chance to reclaim my childhood home. In the meantime, I found out through my friend across the street that my mother had tried to rent out one of the spare rooms to make extra money. She'd apparently posted an ad online stating that it was her property. When I heard that, I was livid. She had no right to sublet any part of the house without my permission. I immediately contacted my lawyer, who recommended I send a cease and desist letter or consider beginning the eviction process. I had tried to be reasonable, but her latest stunt showed me she had no intention of respecting my ownership. I called her up and asked her what the hell she was thinking. She played dumb at first, acting like she didn't know it was a problem. Then she said she was desperate and couldn't afford the rent unless she rented out the room. I asked why she thought it was okay to profit off my property without consulting me. She had no answer. I told her that if she tried it again, I'd serve her eviction papers immediately. She screamed into the phone, accusing me of heartlessness and greed. I hung up, shaken but resolved. She was leaving me no choice. I had a long talk with my lawyer. He advised me to move quickly if I wanted to avoid further complications. The last thing I needed was a random stranger moving in, complicating the process. So, I filed for eviction, naming my mother and her husband. As painful as it was, it felt necessary. Once my mother received the eviction notice, all hell broke loose. She bombarded me with messages, some begging for mercy, others threatening to destroy my reputation. She claimed she would tell everyone I was an abusive child who had tormented her for years. It was laughable, given that I'd lived with Dad most of my life. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Part of me wondered if I was doing the right thing, but every time I doubted myself, I'd remember all the times she put her own needs before mine, how she sold my keepsakes, and how she never once apologized. The day she was served, I got a call from my step-siblings. They were furious, blaming me for uprooting their lives. I told them to take it up with their parents. I wasn't about to coddle them. They were old enough to understand that actions have consequences. Their father tried to confront me in person at my college campus, which was intimidating, but I reported him to campus security. I didn't want any part of his drama. Finally, the court date arrived. My mother made a last-minute attempt to delay, claiming health issues, but the judge saw through it. My lawyer presented the deed and the will, demonstrating clear ownership in my name. He also showed the texts and voicemails where my mother admitted she was selling my belongings and refused to pay rent. The judge had little patience for her sob story. He ruled in my favor, giving her 2 weeks to vacate. When we walked out of the courtroom, my mother tried one last emotional appeal. She said she'd be homeless, that her husband had lost his job and couldn't support them. She begged me to give them more time or at least let the stepkids stay. I stared at her, remembering how she'd looked at me with cold indifference when she sold my cherished possessions. Her tears didn't move me. I'd given her more chances than she ever deserved. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that this was her consequence for betraying me. I mentioned how Dad had worked so hard to protect me because he knew exactly who she was. Then I turned around and left. Eviction day came faster than I'd expected. I went to the house with my lawyer and a couple of friends for support. My mother and her family were scrambling to load their stuff into a moving truck. There was no sign of the fancy new furniture she'd bought with the money from selling my belongings. Apparently, they'd had to pawn a lot of stuff just to stay afloat. She glared at me as if I were the devil incarnate. Her husband made some snide remark about how I'd burn in hell for doing this to them. I didn't bother responding. My lawyer reminded them they had to leave peacefully or risk being escorted out by law enforcement. They piled into their cars and drove off without so much as a goodbye. For a moment, I felt a strange heaviness settle over me. I was finally standing in my own house, the one Dad had left me. The rooms were largely empty, stripped down to the bare walls. Everything I'd left there as a child was gone, sold, or discarded. But as I wandered from room to room, I realized it was also a chance for a new start. My mother's presence was no longer lurking in the corners, filling the air with resentment. It was mine, for better or worse, and I felt a rush of gratitude toward my dad. Even in death, he had looked out for me. I thought about the financial hit I'd taken with my belongings gone. Some had been priceless in sentimental value, others worth actual money. I spoke to the lawyer about a possible lawsuit against my mother, but he advised that it might be more trouble than it was worth, especially if she and her husband were already broke. Still, I wasn't in the mood to offer any mercy. They had found money to buy furniture and do renovations, so maybe they had resources I didn't know about. I ended up filing a police report for theft. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but he warned me it could be a long process. I wasn't doing it for the money. I wanted a legal record of what she'd done. If she tried to come back into my life, I wanted proof of her betrayal. Maybe the investigation would deter her from pulling any more stunts. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction in knowing she had to scramble to find a place to live. She would no longer benefit from my father's generosity. In the weeks that followed, I got sporadic text messages from random numbers, presumably her or her husband, hurling insults and curses at me. I blocked each one as soon as I realized who it was. I knew they were angry, but they had done this to themselves. After the house was cleared out, I began renovating it in my own style. I set up a small memorial corner for my dad with a framed photo and a few items that reminded me of him. I knew he'd have been proud to see me taking control of my life. I moved in full-time, grateful for the haven he left me. My mother never showed up at the doorstep again. Maybe she was too ashamed, or maybe she just knew she wouldn't be welcome. People have asked me if I regret being so harsh. The truth is, no. She betrayed me when I was at my lowest. She chose her new family over me in the most callous way. My dad's final gift was not just the house, but also the chance to break free from her control. She sold my possessions, but she couldn't sell my future, and I'm not about to forgive her for that. Goodbye. I never expected my father to skip my wedding, yet that's exactly what happened. My parents divorced when I was 12, and we all tried to keep some semblance of normalcy. For a while, it seemed to work. He'd see me on weekends, we'd have family dinners on my birthday, and I clung to the hope that even though our family was split, my father would always be there when it truly mattered. Then, my mom remarried, and my stepdad became an unexpected pillar of support. Meanwhile, my older brother, Kyle, stayed under our father's influence, forging a strong bond over camping trips, fishing expeditions, and off-road adventures. I learned early on that my father was far more attentive to Kyle's hobbies than to anything going on in my life. Whenever I tried to share an achievement in school or mention a performance I was excited about, he'd show lukewarm interest at best. I kept telling myself that he was simply more outdoorsy, so maybe it was easier for him to connect with Kyle, but deep down, it hurt to see the imbalance. Over the years, I continued to hope that when a major milestone came along, he'd put me first just once. My wedding was the milestone I thought would bring us together. My fiance, Jason, proposed to me in a sweet, intimate way, and soon after, we announced our engagement. My stepdad and mom were thrilled. They offered to help with anything we needed, picking out invitations, scouting venues, sampling cake. My father, by contrast, seemed uninterested. His first response to my engagement news was to mention Kyle's hiking trip. At the time, I brushed it off. I wanted to believe he just needed time to process. Little did I know how wrong I was. I sent out invitations months in advance, determined not to leave room for excuses. I texted him reminders about the date, told him how important it was for me to have him there, and even asked if he'd like to walk me down the aisle. He gave me half-hearted confirmations saying things like, "We'll see," or "Let me think about it." I tried not to let it bring me down. Instead, I channeled my energy into creating the wedding of my dreams. Then, 1 month before the big day, Kyle casually mentioned that he and Dad were leaving for a 5-day wilderness trek on the weekend of my wedding. My heart sank. I thought maybe they'd made a mistake, so I confronted my father, reminding him of the ceremony date. He responded with a short message that read, "I'm sorry, but Kyle and I have been looking forward to this trip for a long time. Congratulations on your marriage." That was it. No phone call, no explanation about why he chose that trip over my wedding. Nothing. I felt gutted. My stepdad offered to speak with him, but I refused. If my father couldn't see for himself how hurtful this was, I didn't want anyone else shaming him into it. The week before my wedding, I had one final call with him where he merely said, "Good luck." The emotional distance in his voice cut me to the core. I hung up and cried, realizing he wasn't coming. My father was choosing a camping trip over witnessing the moment I said, "I do." It felt like a permanent blow, a confirmation of all my worst fears about where I ranked in his priorities. Still, I tried not to let it ruin my wedding day. The wedding itself was everything I could have hoped for under the circumstances. My stepdad walked me down the aisle, his face shining with pride. I remember how steady his arm felt and how grateful I was to have someone who truly cared about me by my side. My mom was radiant, cheering me on from the front row. Jason looked teary-eyed, yet overjoyed as I approached. Everyone I loved was there, except my father. I won't pretend I didn't notice the empty seat we'd reserved for him. But once the music played and I saw my soon-to-be husband's face, my heart steadied. The ceremony was filled with personal vows, heartfelt speeches, and genuine laughter. When the official photos came back, I was relieved to see all the happiness captured. My bridesmaids helping me get ready, Jason and I dancing, my stepdad and me sharing a tender moment. I decided not to dwell on the fact that one person was missing. We shared those photos online, and my mom posted a few to her page, proudly announcing that her daughter was now married. People commented, congratulating us and asking questions about the celebration. A few relatives wondered where my father was, but we kept our answers vague, simply saying he had other plans. It still stung, but I wanted to focus on the joy of the day rather than the glaring absence. About 3 weeks later, when the wedding buzz had settled, my father left me a voicemail, sounding teary. He said he didn't realize how important the aisle moment was until he saw the photos. He asked if we could meet, adding that he wanted to talk. I didn't know what to expect, but I agreed. Part of me wanted to see if he'd actually apologize. We met at a small cafe near my apartment. He arrived looking anxious, eyes rimmed with sadness I'd never witnessed before. The moment he saw me, he tried to hug me, but I stepped back. He started by saying he regretted missing my wedding, that he never intended to hurt me. He claimed he'd thought my stepdad would handle it, as if it was a casual errand rather than the single most important walk of my life. Then, in a turn that nearly made me laugh out loud, he said he wanted a second ceremony. He wanted a chance to walk me down the aisle properly, to give me away. He pleaded that it didn't have to be big or expensive, just something for the family. I was stunned by his nerve. It felt like he was more concerned about not featuring in the wedding photos than about my feelings. I listened quietly, my anger building. When he finished, I told him there would be no second ceremony. My wedding was over. I was married. He'd missed his chance. He started crying, saying he felt shut out and that he realized too late how significant it all was. A small part of me empathized, but I remembered the text he'd sent, the way he'd casually brushed off my big day. I refused to let that memory fade, so I stood firm. I let him know that I was deeply hurt and it wasn't something a do-over could fix. Then I walked out, leaving him at the table with tears in his eyes. If that sounds cold, so be it. I'd spent my entire life trying to accommodate him. It was time he faced the consequences of his choices. That was the day I decided I wasn't going to give him an easy way out. That first confrontation sparked my desire for a more deliberate form of revenge. I'd always been the one to bridge the gap, to chase after his attention. Now, I wanted him to understand, deeply and painfully, that I wasn't going to keep doing that. So I cut off the small gestures. No more casual updates, no more invitations to family events, no more mentions of my life milestones. My mother and stepdad respected my decision, and my mom made it clear to him that if he wanted information, he'd have to seek it out himself. Some relatives called me harsh, but others recognized that he'd finally gone too far. He kept calling, leaving voicemails, sometimes sounding desperate, sometimes offering gifts like a honeymoon upgrade. It was insulting that he thought I could be bought. I stopped answering those calls and only responded to texts when they were polite and acknowledged the reality that he had broken my trust. I also posted more photos from the wedding, many of them showing my stepdad beaming with pride as we danced or posed for family shots. My father had seen the earlier pictures, and he knew how central my stepdad had been to the day. Now, with each new post, he got another reminder of what he'd missed. I refused to mention my father's absence in the captions, keeping the tone positive. Let people do the math themselves. Over time, he became a ghost on social media, not commenting or reacting, but definitely lurking. The few times I allowed myself a glance at his profile, I saw him trying to do damage control, claiming he'd had a scheduling conflict or that there'd been a misunderstanding. Nobody was buying it, especially Kyle, who'd posted pictures from their camping trip that same weekend. The contrast was embarrassing for him. Then he showed up on my doorstep one day with a bouquet of flowers, looking contrite. I didn't let him in. I stood outside, shutting the door behind me, and listened to him beg for a chance to talk. He said he wanted to be part of my life, to be a grandfather someday if I ever had kids, to make up for all the neglect. He apologized repeatedly, insisting he hadn't realized how much I'd wanted him there. Those words infuriated me. How could anyone not realize their daughter wants them at her wedding? But I kept my composure. I told him actions speak louder than words. If he truly wanted to prove himself, it wouldn't be through a second ceremony or lavish gifts. It would be through consistent effort over time. Then he asked if we could at least schedule a family dinner just to talk things out in a calmer setting. I said no. My boundaries had been shattered enough. I told him I'd reach out when and if I was ready. He looked devastated, but I didn't budge. For once, I felt in control. As I closed the door, I felt the strangest mix of sadness and empowerment. Here was the father I'd once idolized, finally humbled, and I wasn't about to console him. Maybe some people would call me heartless, but I saw it as justice. After years of being an afterthought, I was no longer pandering to his ego. He had to live with the shame of missing my wedding and with the knowledge that his own daughter no longer viewed him as indispensable. That was my revenge, letting him marinate in the regret of his own choices without throwing him a lifeline. In the meantime, I focused on building a life with Jason. We settled into a comfortable routine, making a home out of our new place and enjoying our marriage. My stepdad and I became closer, bonding over the fact that he was the one who walked me down the aisle. He never tried to replace my father, but he didn't have to. He simply showed up, time and time again. My mother, always the peacekeeper, admitted she felt torn at times. She didn't like seeing my father so distressed, but she also understood that he'd made his bed. Kyle reached out to apologize, saying he felt guilty for not pushing Dad to postpone the trip. I told him I didn't blame him personally. It was Dad's decision to prioritize that outing over my wedding, not his. Kyle said he understood if I needed time to heal. He seemed genuine in his remorse, but he also couldn't rewrite what had happened. Through it all, my father kept trying. He sent me emails every few weeks, detailing how sorry he was, how he wanted to start fresh. He said he understood that the wedding was a missed opportunity, but he hoped we could salvage our relationship before it was too late. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let him wonder. Part of me wanted to see if he'd keep trying or if he'd give up the first time he didn't get an immediate reply. He continued to send messages, each one softer than the last, filled with more apologies and less self-justification. That consistency was the only thing that made me consider reopening the door, even a crack. But I wasn't done making him realize just how badly he'd hurt me. So I stayed silent, letting him twist in the wind. Over time, the calls from extended family urging me to have compassion slowed down. People saw that I was resolute. Some relatives tried to paint me as harsh, but my mother and stepdad defended me, explaining how my father had repeatedly sidelined me for years. Eventually, most people stopped pushing, realizing I wasn't in a forgiving mood. My father still told anyone who would listen that he hoped for a redo ceremony, some vow renewal where he could walk me down the aisle. Each time I heard about it, I felt my anger rekindle. The fact he kept harping on a second ceremony showed me he didn't grasp the root issue, the betrayal. It wasn't about a photo op or a single moment. It was about him choosing to leave me on my most important day. Trying to replicate a wedding to soothe his conscience was both insulting and selfish. My real wedding was perfect without him. I had the father figure I needed. I didn't need an encore. After several months, he seemed to accept there would be no do-over. His messages turned less theatrical, focusing instead on how he missed me and wanted to rebuild trust. He said he understood he'd have to prove himself with consistent actions. That was the first time I saw a glimmer of real insight. Maybe my revenge was working. By refusing to give him an easy out, I was forcing him to confront the fallout of his own neglect. In a twisted way, it felt satisfying. I wasn't cackling in a corner, but I felt vindicated. All my life, I'd tried to earn his attention. Now he was trying to earn mine, and I was making him work for it. That alone felt like closure in ways I never thought possible. Finally, I decided to write him a measured email. I thanked him for apologizing and for offering to be consistent. Then I told him that as far as I was concerned, forgiveness wouldn't be a single event. It would be a gradual process contingent on him showing genuine concern and respect for my life. I reiterated that I would never host a second wedding or vow renewal just to placate his regret. The wedding day had passed. My husband and I were happy. He needed to live with his choice. If he truly wanted to repair our bond, it would have to happen slowly and organically without forcing me into staged ceremonies. I kept the tone calm but firm. He replied a few days later, expressing understanding and a willingness to try. He didn't bring up the second ceremony again, which was a relief. I still felt a sense of power, knowing I was dictating the terms. Maybe some people would say I should open my heart more, but they haven't spent years feeling overshadowed by a sibling, unseen by a parent who was supposed to show unconditional love. For me, establishing these boundaries was the healthiest form of revenge. It wasn't about hurling insults or humiliating him publicly. It was about letting him see that I no longer needed or craved his validation. If he wanted a place in my life, he had to meet me on my terms. That, in itself, was a reversal of our entire relationship dynamic. Over time, I discovered that hurting him wasn't the primary goal anymore. I just wanted him to feel the magnitude of what he'd thrown away by skipping my wedding. And if he felt guilty, well, that guilt was earned. Where do things stand now? My father and I exchange occasional messages, mostly to check in. Sometimes he asks if we can meet for coffee, and sometimes I say yes. We keep it short, discussing surface-level topics. How my job is going, what Jason and I are up to. He's on his best behavior, never pushing for a second wedding anymore. We haven't reached a place of warmth or deep trust, but we're no longer strangers. I see this as the final stage of my revenge. I let him hover on the edge of my life, uncertain if he'll ever be fully welcomed back. I don't hate him. I don't even spend much time resenting him. But I will never forget that my stepdad was the one who walked me down the aisle. That moment belongs to us, and my father will never get it back. Sometimes I think about future milestones, like if I have a child someday. Will my father show up then, or will he be distracted by something else? The difference is, I no longer lie awake worrying about it. If he fails again, that's on him. My wedding taught me a lesson about who you can count on. My father was the one who taught me that lesson by choosing not to be there. No second ceremony will change that. I'm content with how everything turned out, and I've learned to keep my guard up around him. If that's revenge, so be it. I'd rather have this closeness than open myself up to another betrayal. I'd say I've found my peace. My father missed my wedding, and now he has to live with the fact that I've built a life without him at its center. He must accept that truth, and I am finally free. From the moment I discovered I was pregnant, I felt a mix of terror and excitement that most expectant mothers feel. I was 25 and had been married for just under 2 years. My husband and I had deliberately waited until we felt ready, and when that positive test finally came, we were genuinely happy. However, I could never have anticipated the mess that would unravel with my own mother. She'd always been protective, but never in my wildest imagination did I think she'd try to steal my baby. This happened last year, and the fallout has been devastating, albeit freeing. I grew up in a household that revolved around my younger sister, Emily. She was a high achiever, a social butterfly, and according to our mother, destined for greatness. Whenever I accomplished something, my mother's first comment would usually revolve around how Emily might do it even better. I eventually got used to it, finished high school, went to college, and met the man who'd become my husband. There were no major arguments or rifts, but my mother's favoritism was always there, simmering beneath the surface. When Emily got engaged, my mother became even more intense about everything. I announced my pregnancy a few weeks after Emily set her wedding date. I was about 3 months along at the time. My family seemed happy overall. My dad gave me a big hug, and Emily squealed with delight. But my mother had a weird expression I couldn't read. She forced a smile, congratulated me, then immediately asked if my due date would interfere with Emily's wedding. I told her it wouldn't because Emily was getting married in the late summer and my baby was due in early spring. In theory, there'd be several months difference, so no direct conflict. Over the next few months, my mother's behavior became erratic. She complained that my pregnancy was overshadowing Emily's engagement, even though nobody else seemed to think so. She refused to accompany me to any prenatal checkups and kept urging me not to mention the baby too much around Emily. My sister, for her part, didn't seem bothered at all. She was thrilled to become an aunt. But my mother kept pushing this idea that all eyes had to be on Emily, and I should know better than to steal the spotlight. It made family gatherings incredibly awkward. Right before I gave birth, Emily's wedding planning was in full swing. My mother was running around picking venues, tasting cakes, and yelling at florists. She refused to talk about my baby at all. At my baby shower, which was organized by my best friend, my mother showed up late, gave me an obviously re-gifted item, and left early. She called me the next day and reminded me not to get too comfy with the attention since the wedding was only a few months away. I chalked it up to her typical obsession with Emily and tried to shrug it off. My son arrived without complications. The day I went into labor, my mother didn't pick up her phone. My father visited us at the hospital, but my mother was conspicuously absent. Emily came by briefly, apologized for our mom, and said she was busy with wedding stuff. I tried not to let it bother me. My son was healthy, and that was all that mattered. I posted a quick birth announcement online, which got a lot of positive feedback from friends and family. That same evening, I received a cold text from my mother, "Don't show him off too much." 2 weeks after we brought my son home, I got a call from a local adoption agency. At first, I assumed it was a telemarketer or some spam call, but the woman on the line mentioned specific details, my name, my husband's name, and even my baby's name, asking if we were proceeding with the adoption plan we'd initiated. I was stunned. I told her she had to be mistaken. She insisted she had our information, all properly submitted with forms that had my forged signature on them. She asked if I still wanted to proceed. I immediately hung up and called my husband, who was equally shocked. We agreed that this had to be some sick joke or a mistake, but I was too unsettled to ignore it, so we drove to the agency in person. The staff there looked uncomfortable when we arrived. They handed me photocopies of forms that supposedly bore my signature. It was a sloppy imitation of my handwriting, but enough to fool someone who didn't know me well. My blood ran cold when I saw my mother's name listed as the person assisting with the arrangement. She had done this. I confronted my mother that same evening. I called her repeatedly until she picked up. She acted clueless at first, feigning ignorance about everything. When I mentioned the adoption agency by name, she let out a heavy sigh and told me to stop overreacting. She said I was too young, not financially stable enough, and that having a baby just before Emily's wedding would create unwanted drama. She insisted my baby was better off with another family. The calmness in her voice was chilling, as though she genuinely believed she was doing something noble. I felt sick to my stomach. That night, I was too furious to sleep. My husband and I talked about our options. My first instinct was to cut her off entirely and never look back, but the gravity of what she did went beyond a personal grudge. She forged documents in an attempt to give my baby away. That was criminal. We also suspected she might try something else. If she was capable of forging signatures, who knew what else she might do? So we contacted a lawyer the next day. He was appalled by the story and immediately helped us file the necessary paperwork. I informed my father about what was going on. He was horrified and said he had no idea my mother was doing any of this. He knew she was fixated on Emily's wedding, but he never believed she'd go that far. Emily was also shocked and offered to talk to our mother, but we advised her not to get involved beyond providing moral support. We wanted a clear line of action that wouldn't be muddled by family drama. The lawyer guided us through obtaining an emergency protection order to prevent my mother from making any further attempts at interfering. Within a week, I received an angry phone call from my mother. She screeched at me for dragging the family name through the mud by involving a lawyer. She also demanded I drop everything because Emily's wedding is soon and we don't need this scandal. I told her we were done speaking unless it was through legal channels. She tried to guilt trip me, claiming she was only doing what was best for me and my baby. I hung up. A few days later, I was served with official documents indicating my mother was disputing the protection order. The hearing for the protection order was scheduled. My mother showed up with a lawyer she'd apparently hired at great expense. She argued that she'd never intended to actually go through with the adoption and that it was all a misunderstanding. The judge listened quietly. Our lawyer presented the documents from the adoption agency, the forged signatures, and testimony from the agency staff. My mother's lawyer tried to cast doubt on the authenticity of the signatures, but it was an uphill battle. The judge granted the protection order, citing that there was substantial evidence of my mother's misconduct. After the protection order was in place, I started getting calls from extended family, all repeating the same plea. "It's almost Emily's wedding. Can't you just let it go for now?" They didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what my mother had done. Forging documents to put my child up for adoption wasn't a small mishap. Some relatives thought I was overreacting. I stopped taking their calls. My focus was on safeguarding my baby and ensuring my mother faced consequences. When the district attorney contacted me regarding possible criminal charges, I cooperated fully. I wanted justice. Emily's wedding arrived. I didn't attend. My mother was still under a protection order, and I wanted no drama. I sent Emily a heartfelt message, apologizing for missing her big day, but explaining I couldn't risk any confrontation. She understood, though I could sense her disappointment. Meanwhile, my mother played the martyr at the wedding, telling anyone who would listen that I was hell-bent on ruining Emily's special moment. A few cousins texted me, saying they heard my mother ranting, but by then, I'd grown numb to the gossip. My priority was my family's safety and peace. After the wedding, my mother apparently thought I'd back down. She was wrong. The criminal investigation proceeded. The district attorney gathered evidence that included statements from the adoption agency, the forged documents, and phone records showing repeated contact between my mother and the agency. I provided every scrap of communication I had, including her text messages. My mother's lawyer tried to argue she was under stress due to wedding preparations and acted irrationally, but that didn't excuse forging legal paperwork to put a baby up for adoption. The prosecution pushed forward, and soon charges were formally filed against her. When my mother was arrested, she posted bail almost immediately. My extended family erupted in chaos. Some said I was tearing the family apart. Others quietly supported me, saying they'd always known my mother had a cruel streak but never expected it to go this far. My father was heartbroken. He still lived with her but claimed they barely spoke. Emily tried to keep the peace, but it was impossible. Our mother was facing serious charges, attempted fraud, forgery, and a slew of related offenses. She tried to contact me again, but my lawyer advised me not to respond. The legal process dragged on for months. During this time, I focused on my son. Watching him grow became my primary source of joy. I found a therapist who helped me process the betrayal I felt. My mother's actions had shattered any illusions I had about her. Therapy gave me space to grieve the mother I wished I'd had and accept the reality of the one I did. There was no going back. Forgiveness wasn't on the table. I wanted her punished, and I felt no remorse about it. That clarity empowered me to keep fighting relentlessly. Eventually, the case went to trial. My mother sat across the courtroom, looking composed in her expensive suit. She'd hired a new lawyer by then, someone with a reputation for being aggressive. I felt a surge of anger every time I looked at her, remembering how she tried to take my baby from me. The prosecution presented the evidence, recorded statements from the adoption agency, the forged forms, and even bank records showing my mother had paid certain fees in advance. My mother's lawyer tried to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who misunderstood her mother's intentions. I testified, recounting every detail of what had happened. The judge and jury heard how I discovered the scheme, the forged signatures, and my mother's threatening messages. The defense tried to rattle me by bringing up family issues, suggesting I was exaggerating out of spite. But the facts spoke for themselves. My mother had no excuse for forging my signature on legal documents. It was a clear violation of the law. The adoption agency representatives confirmed everything, leaving the defense little room to maneuver. By the end of the trial, it was obvious where the truth lay. The jury deliberated for a day before reaching a verdict. My mother was found guilty on multiple counts, including forgery and attempted fraud. She wasn't taken into custody immediately. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date. I felt a rush of vindication, but it was tinged with sadness. This was my mother after all, but she'd crossed a line I couldn't overlook. The rest of my family was torn. Some believed justice had been served, others blamed me for not keeping it in the family. Regardless, I had no regrets. My child's safety and well-being came first. When sentencing day arrived, my mother appeared in court with the same defiant attitude. She read a statement declaring her love for me and her grandchild, insisting that she'd only tried to do what she believed was best. The judge was unmoved. The evidence of her deliberate actions was overwhelming. She was sentenced to serve time in prison, along with fines and mandatory counseling. The moment the gavel came down, I felt a surreal sense of closure. My mother, the person who tried to steal my baby's future, was finally facing the legal consequences of her actions. Justice. My father tried to convince me to visit her in prison. He said she was remorseful, that she wanted to apologize. But I remembered the countless chances she'd had to stop or come clean. She never did. She only doubled down when I resisted her plans. As far as I was concerned, she wasn't welcome in my life or my child's. My father was torn up about it, but he respected my boundaries. Emily reached out occasionally, updating me on how our mother was doing, but I cut those conversations short. I had no interest in her remorse. In the months following her conviction, I focused on rebuilding my life. I went back to work, and my husband and I found a new routine. We attended more therapy sessions, strengthening our relationship and fortifying our resolve to protect our family. My son was thriving, hitting milestones, and bringing light into every day. Occasionally, I'd hear a new rumor about how my mother was blaming me for her downfall, but I refused to let it get to me. She had tried to ruin my life and my baby's future, and she deserved every consequence she received. Legally, the matter was settled, but emotionally, I was still healing. My mother had betrayed me in a way that felt almost unimaginable. She hadn't just hurt me, she attempted to orchestrate a future where my baby would be raised by strangers. The only solace I found was in the knowledge that she was held accountable. I wasn't interested in any reconciliation or closure talk. My mother had shown me exactly who she was, and I believed her. The courts may have decided her fate, but in my eyes, she had sentenced herself to permanent exile from my life. People often describe revenge as a dish best served cold, but in my case, it was a matter of survival. My mother showed me who she was. A woman willing to betray her own daughter to maintain a facade of a perfect family event. I didn't seek her destruction out of petty spite. I sought legal recourse because she threatened my child's future, and I'd do it again if I had to. There's no making amends for trying to place someone's newborn for adoption behind their back. At least now, she can't harm my family any further. That's my story. My mother is convicted, serving her sentence, and I have no intention of ever letting her back into my life. She tried to take my baby away because she couldn't stand the thought of someone else receiving attention during my sister's wedding season. I hope she realizes the depth of her wrongdoing, but even if she doesn't, I'm at peace. My son is safe, my husband and I are stronger than ever, and I've learned that I don't owe anyone forgiveness. Justice was served, and I have no regrets. That's how I took my life back. I couldn't be happier with the outcome. I never imagined I'd be typing this, but here I am, sharing my life's biggest betrayal on an anonymous forum. My wife and I were married for almost 30 years. We had 2 kids, our son Michael, and our daughter Kayla. I truly believed we'd grow old side by side, building memories and watching our grandchildren run around. That belief died when Kayla showed up on my doorstep last year and revealed the truth about what had really happened back when Michael was still in high school. I've spent the past months unraveling the twisted lies that shaped my relationship with my own son, and now I'm determined to get the revenge I deserve. Michael was always closer to my wife, while Kayla tended to bond with me whenever minor family disagreements cropped up. I never saw anything sinister in it. But when Michael turned 16, he changed. He grew distant and resentful toward me, stopped asking for my advice, and avoided our usual outings. I chalked it up to teenage angst. We'd argue and he'd shout that I didn't understand him. His mother intervened and gave me rationalizations. I thought I should let him figure out his own feelings. I spent years trying to repair our bond, but he only drew further away. By graduation, he barely spoke to me. Eventually, he cut me off almost completely, except for obligatory holiday visits. Then, 4 years ago, right after I retired, Michael stopped visiting altogether. The only connection we had was a group text my wife moderated. It tore me up inside, wondering why my own son seemed to despise me. I never suspected the betrayal that was festering behind the scenes, nor the lies woven by the person I had trusted most. Here we truly are at last, finally. I never blamed Kayla for staying in contact with her mother. They always had a good relationship, and I wasn't about to weaponize my divorce plans. Because yes, once Kayla told me everything, I knew there was no salvaging my marriage. It turns out my wife had an affair around the time Michael was 16. She'd started seeing a coworker from the accounting firm where she used to work. Kayla was only 12 then, but she caught her mother lying about late nights at the office. Like any curious kid, she snooped. She found texts on her mother's phone, read some explicit details, and was terrified to tell me. Instead, she confronted her mother. My wife reacted by swearing Kayla to secrecy. Kayla was scared and agreed, but always kept that knowledge locked inside. Meanwhile, Michael discovered something was off, but never got the full story. My wife manipulated him, implying that I was the one who'd stepped out on the marriage, or that my controlling nature drove her to seek emotional support elsewhere. She fed him twisted half-truths, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. Michael believed her. In his eyes, I was the unfaithful father who broke his mother's heart and forced him to live in tension. That explained his anger toward me. When Kayla grew older, she realized how twisted everything was. She tried confronting her mother again, but my wife refused to come clean. Then Kayla reached out to me, guilt-ridden, for not exposing the affair sooner. She asked if I'd ever cheated on my wife. The question floored me. I had never so much as considered it. That's when Kayla told me everything. In that moment, I felt my world flip upside down, like I'd been asleep for years. I felt betrayed. I confronted my wife that same night. I waited until Kayla left, sat my wife down, and calmly asked if there was anything she wanted to tell me. She gave me that blank stare I'd seen so many times before, the one that often preceded half-hearted excuses. This time, I didn't let her speak. I laid out what Kayla told me. I expected anger or tears, maybe even denial. Instead, she just looked tired, like someone who'd finally been cornered. She admitted to the affair, just once, she claimed. She insisted she ended it quickly, that it was a mistake, and that she kept quiet to avoid tearing our family apart. She blamed me for being distant, for working too much, for never being the husband she needed. None of that mattered to me. The real wound was how she'd manipulated Michael. She tried to spin it, saying Michael had simply drawn his own conclusions, that he'd been upset at me for other reasons. But I knew she was lying. She'd let Michael hate me for her misdeeds. She'd allowed me to be alienated from my son without ever trying to set the record straight. 30 years of marriage shattered by her selfishness. I told her we were done. She scoffed like she expected me to back down. She told me I was overreacting, that Michael's estrangement was partly my fault for not trying harder. She said Kayla was stirring up drama. I just grabbed my coat, walked out, and drove to a hotel. I left her there with her guilt or whatever sliver of conscience she had left. I was livid and felt the painful sting of all the years lost. But I also felt a strange clarity, like a switch flipped in my mind. I wanted revenge, punishing revenge. I contacted an attorney the following day. By then, I was resolved to finalize a divorce. But I also wanted to correct Michael's perception. I couldn't stand the idea that he still believed I'd been unfaithful or abusive. The attorney advised me to gather evidence of the affair, just in case. Kayla handed over screenshots of texts she had saved long ago, plus a few pictures she snapped of her mother's phone. The messages were explicit proof of my wife's betrayal. I also found old receipts from restaurants and hotels that didn't match the dates she'd given me for business trips. It felt like walking back through time, connecting the dots I should have seen years ago. Next, I privately reached out to Michael. I simply said I wanted to meet. He refused. He told me he had no interest in rehashing the past. I almost gave up, but Kayla insisted we not let her mother's lies continue poisoning him. So I wrote Michael a letter. Yes, an actual handwritten letter. I told him that I knew we'd been estranged for years, but that I loved him regardless. I said there was something crucial about our family history he needed to hear. I didn't beg for his sympathy, just asked him to listen. I enclosed copies of a few texts between my wife and her affair partner, with explicit timestamps from that period. Then I mailed it off. 2 weeks passed, no response. I was preparing myself for the possibility that Michael would never contact me again. Meanwhile, my wife kept calling. She left voicemails alternating between threats and apologies. She insisted I shouldn't drag Michael into our marital problems, but she'd done precisely that for years. My anger only grew, fueling my determination to see this through. I wanted justice. Then, out of the blue, Michael showed up unannounced at my doorstep. He looked tense, like he'd been wrestling with his conscience. Without a word, he handed me the pages I'd sent, silently daring me to explain. So I did. I told him everything Kayla had shared, showed him more evidence, and answered every question he fired at me. By the end, I could see the anger in his eyes, the anger that was no longer aimed at me. He realized he'd spent years resenting the wrong parent. I expected him to break down or maybe storm away, but he just stood there, quiet and trembling. Then Michael asked why I never fought back, why I never told him my side of the story sooner. I admitted that I never thought my wife, his mother, would spin such vicious lies. I believed I'd eventually reconcile with my son through honest conversations, never imagining there was a secret this massive behind it all. Michael didn't cry. He just shook his head and said he felt betrayed by the person he'd trusted most. Hearing that broke my heart. Still, I cautioned him that the divorce would get ugly. My wife was already trying to paint me as irrational and vindictive, using Michael's estrangement as proof that I'd been a terrible husband. I told him I didn't need him to pick sides, only that he deserved to know the truth. He nodded and said he needed time to process. Then, almost as an afterthought, he apologized for hating me all these years. I told him it wasn't his fault, that the blame rested squarely on his mother. When he left, I felt a wave of relief, but I also felt that scorching drive for revenge intensify even further. It consumed my thoughts, day and night, relentlessly. My attorney moved forward with the divorce filing. I opted for a no-fault approach initially, hoping to keep things simpler. But I wanted to expose my wife's infidelity if needed, especially if she tried to twist the narrative. Unsurprisingly, she fought back, claiming emotional distress and attempting to secure a larger share of our assets. She even hinted she might call Michael as a witness, expecting him to support her allegations of my supposed cruelty. Her arrogance astounded me. Meanwhile, Kayla had been staying with me off and on. She worked on the other side of town but came by on weekends. She was the one who suggested that I get a private investigator to see if my wife was still cheating. Frankly, I didn't care if she was sleeping with half the city at that point, but Kayla argued that any recent infidelity might further discredit my wife's sob story. So I hired someone to follow her discreetly. Within a week, I received photos of my wife meeting the same coworker at a motel. It was still going on after all these years. I was livid, but not surprised. My attorney advised me to keep this evidence under wraps until the right moment. I agreed. Michael was still distant, but he would occasionally text me short questions about my perspective on certain events from his teenage years. I answered patiently, never pressuring him to see me again. I wanted him to come to terms with the facts at his own pace. Deep down, I suspect he was grappling with guilt. He'd let his mother's lies define our relationship. I understood he needed time. My focus was on building an airtight case for the divorce and preparing for the day I'd confront my wife with every last piece of evidence. The day of reckoning came during a settlement conference. My wife arrived with her lawyer, looking smug and confident. She probably thought Michael's old hostility toward me would keep me from pushing back too hard, but I had no intention of playing nice. We started discussing asset division, and her attorney made outrageous demands: spousal support for an indefinite period, the house, and a hefty chunk of my retirement. She claimed she'd sacrificed her career to care for the family, painting me as an ungrateful husband who'd benefited from her domestic labor. I was prepared for this narrative. My attorney quietly slid the evidence across the table, photos of her current affair and the old screenshots with explicit timestamps. Her lawyer's eyes widened and my wife's face paled. I watched her composure crack. She stammered something about irrelevance, claiming these were old issues. My attorney pointed out that the affair was ongoing and that it directly impacted the question of spousal support. If she was living with or intimately involved with another partner, the court might reconsider her claim. The look on her face was priceless. Then, I dropped the final bombshell. I presented the letter from Michael. He'd written it just a few days before the conference, explaining that he'd recently learned the truth about the affair and clarified that I was never unfaithful. He apologized for not speaking up sooner and stated he wouldn't support any false claims. My wife's lawyer grew visibly uncomfortable. The smugness vanished from her face entirely. All her posturing fell flat, and she looked like a trapped animal. We took a short recess. My wife tried to corner me in the hallway. She hissed that I was destroying our family's reputation. I reminded her that she'd already done that long ago. I refused all mercy. When we resumed, her lawyer tried to negotiate a quick settlement. They proposed a moderate split of assets, some alimony, but nowhere near what they initially demanded. My attorney and I declined. I wanted her to sweat. I wanted to let her know that I would drag every skeleton out of the closet if she pressed her luck. Finally, they caved to more favorable terms. My wife lost her chance at indefinite spousal support. She'd get a smaller monthly payment for a fixed period, and we'd sell the house, splitting the proceeds with a ratio favoring me. It wasn't about the money as much as it was about setting the record straight. By the end of that tense meeting, she looked deflated. The face she once wore, confident, manipulative, self-assured, had vanished. I took no joy in seeing her reduced to that state, but I felt vindicated. For years, she allowed me to be demonized in my son's eyes. She stole precious moments I might have shared with him. If she thought I'd just roll over and accept that, she was dead wrong. Afterward, I sent Michael a text, letting him know how things turned out. He replied that he was sorry it had come to this, but appreciated my honesty. He also said he wanted to meet again. We ended up sitting down for coffee a few days later. He admitted he still felt torn, that part of him loved his mother and struggled to reconcile her actions with the woman he once idolized. I understood. I told him he didn't have to hate her, but he needed to see her for who she was. He nodded. Our relationship was far from perfect, but at least the lies were gone. I finally felt free, in a way I never had before. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but I wasn't quite finished. Maybe I should have been satisfied with the divorce settlement and clearing my name with Michael, but the years of pain and estrangement fueled a lingering fury inside me. I needed a final act of retribution. So, when my wife complained about losing face among our social circle, I decided to make sure everyone knew the truth. I hosted a small get-together, inviting longtime family friends, a few relatives, and some mutual acquaintances. My wife foolishly showed up, probably hoping to do damage control. Instead, she walked into a room of people who had already heard my side. I didn't air dirty laundry in a dramatic speech, nor did I wave around the explicit evidence. I simply told people that any rumors about me being unfaithful were false, and that the actual affair had been entirely hers. I explained that I'd kept silent for Michael's sake, but now I felt compelled to clarify. Kayla corroborated my account. By the end of the evening, my wife looked like she wanted to disappear. She tried to spin the story, saying it was complicated, that I'd neglected her emotionally. Nobody seemed convinced. She left early, and I felt no remorse. I wanted her to understand, in no uncertain terms, that this was the consequence of her lies. Some might say I went too far. They might argue that public humiliation is cruel, but I spent years as the scapegoat, losing priceless moments with my son. I owed her no sympathy. She'd sown the seeds of betrayal, and now she had to harvest the results. After that night, I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot finally untied. My revenge was complete. I never regretted it, ever. In the months that followed, I finalized the divorce paperwork, sold the house, and moved into a smaller place closer to Kayla's job. She visits me regularly, and we share the simple joy of watching old movies or trying new recipes in my modest kitchen. Michael and I stay in touch too. We aren't best friends, but the hostility is gone. We've started to rebuild something resembling a normal father-son relationship. Sometimes he asks if I'll ever forgive his mother. My answer remains the same. I don't see how I could. She purposely destroyed our bond for her own convenience. She expected me to shoulder the blame and suffer quietly. I see no reason to grant her absolution. Last I heard, she's still seeing that coworker. They've become more open about it, possibly because she no longer has to pretend. Her reputation has taken a hit, especially among the people who once believed her sob stories. Some have cut her off entirely. Others maintain contact but keep her at arm's length. I don't particularly care. I did what I had to do to clear my name and protect whatever remained of my relationship with my son. I don't wish her well, nor do I curse her. She exists as a reminder of how fragile trust can be. Do I feel better now that I've had my revenge? In many ways, yes. The anger no longer consumes me. I don't lie awake at night obsessing over what could have been. That satisfaction is enough for me. I'm not naive. I know life doesn't always offer perfect closure, but I've found a sense of peace in making sure the truth prevailed. I lost years with Michael, and I'll never get them back. But at least I didn't let her lies stand unchallenged. I never thought my life would come to this, posting my mess on Reddit for strangers to read, but I need to let it out somewhere because my friends, real friends, are tired of hearing about it. It all started years ago when I was 17 and my sister Kayla decided that she couldn't stand my existence anymore. We were never close, but I never imagined she'd do something so cruel. She spread a rumor to my parents that I was secretly selling drugs at school. No one questioned her story. Without a second thought, I was kicked out of the house. At first, I thought there must be a misunderstanding. I told my parents I had no idea what Kayla was talking about. I'd never even touched marijuana, let alone harder stuff. But they looked at me like I was some junkie. My dad yelled about how he wouldn't have a criminal under his roof. My mom cried and asked how I could betray their trust. Meanwhile, Kayla watched silently from the corner, her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. When I tried to protest, my father shoved a duffel bag into my arms and told me to disappear. I left with what little dignity I had. A friend from school let me crash on his couch, and his parents took pity on me. They were good people who believed me. They even helped me get a part-time job so I could save for my own place. I sometimes snuck back to my old neighborhood at night, just to see if I could figure out why Kayla had done this. Of course, she never gave me a chance. I was persona non grata at my own home. So I kept my head down, worked hard, and focused on surviving. Months passed, then a year. I managed to graduate high school with decent grades, which felt like a miracle given the stress. The day I walked across that stage, I looked into the crowd. I didn't spot my parents or Kayla. I shouldn't have been surprised, but it still hurt. That night, my friend's dad handed me a card with a small amount of money inside. He said he was proud. I nearly broke down in gratitude. That support was a reminder that not everyone believed I was worthless. Determined, I decided to keep going and prove them all wrong. Without any financial help from my family, I found a job as a server. I worked double shifts when possible and eventually moved into a cheap apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. I kept in touch with my friends' parents, who checked in on me occasionally. I tried calling my own parents a couple of times, hoping to clear the air. Each time, my dad hung up and my mom muttered something about trusting Kayla's word over mine. That rejection stung, but I refused to let it break me. I was entirely determined to build a life independently. College wasn't an option right away. I needed more savings, so I enrolled in community college part-time. Over the next 2 years, I juggled classes and work. My grades weren't spectacular, but I passed. I managed to transfer to a state university with a scholarship that covered part of my tuition. By the time I was 20, I had enough financial aid and loans to go full-time. I dove into my studies, focusing on business. I had a vague dream of opening my own place one day. The idea of success, of proving everyone wrong, was what so badly kept me motivated. During this time, Kayla was apparently thriving. She attended a private college and bragged on social media about her fancy internship. My parents beamed in her photos, looking like the proudest family in the world. I felt a sting of resentment, but I reminded myself that one day I'd have something to brag about too. I was forging my own path. Eventually, I rented a small off-campus apartment. I found a decent roommate, studied hard, and managed to maintain a B average. I even started a small side hustle tutoring classmates, which helped me cover some of my living expenses. I was 22 when I finally heard from my parents again. My phone rang late at night. Seeing my dad's name made my stomach drop. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. He sounded tired, older than I remembered. He said my mom was sick. They'd just found out she had a serious heart condition. My first reaction was concern, of course, but then I remembered how they'd thrown me out. My dad asked if I could come visit. He mentioned that Kayla insisted I'd moved far away. I told him I'd seriously think about it. I hung up and spent the night tossing and turning. My parents hadn't been there when I needed them most. They believed Kayla's lies without hesitation. Now, because my mom was sick, they wanted me back in their lives. Part of me felt guilty. If my mom was truly in danger, should I hold a grudge? But another part remembered how badly they'd hurt me. I thought about it for days. Finally, I decided to go home, but only to see my mom in the hospital. I wasn't about to move back in or pretend everything was fine at all. When I arrived, Kayla was sitting in the waiting area. She looked surprised, maybe even annoyed that I'd come. She tried to make small talk, acting as if nothing had happened. I ignored her and went straight to my mom's room. Seeing her so frail made my anger waver, but then she opened her eyes, saw me, and started crying. She apologized for everything, saying she was misled by Kayla's convincing story. She claimed she regretted letting me go. I listened, but I didn't offer comfort or forgiveness. I told her I was there to see if she was okay. My dad arrived soon after. He seemed relieved to see me, but there was no warm hug. He tried to explain that Kayla said she caught me dealing, that she'd found hidden bags of pills in my drawer. I asked if they ever bothered to check. They looked guilty. My mom mumbled that they trusted Kayla because she'd always been a straight-A student. My dad admitted he'd been suspicious of me for a while, though he had no proof. I stood there, hands in my pockets, feeling a whirlwind of emotions. Mostly, I felt so painfully betrayed all over again. I visited my mom regularly for the next week, but I avoided Kayla. She tried to corner me in the hallway once, saying she felt bad about what happened. I glared at her and kept walking. Her apology meant nothing to me. She'd destroyed my life with that lie, and she never admitted it until now. My dad asked me to come home for a family dinner when my mom was discharged, claiming she needed the support. I hesitated, but part of me wanted closure. So I agreed to step into that house again, though I deeply dreaded the confrontation. The place looked the same, except my room was now Kayla's study space. My posters were gone, replaced by her academic awards. I felt a pang of anger. My dad served dinner, and my mom tried making small talk. Kayla fidgeted, unable to meet my eyes. Finally, I asked point blank, why had she lied? She mumbled something about me always getting attention for being the nice one. She claimed I overshadowed her socially, even if her grades were better. She was jealous. That was all it took to ruin my life. I felt a surge of rage I couldn't suppress. I slammed my fork down, demanding to know if that was her entire justification. She flinched and nodded. My parents sat there looking miserable, but I had no sympathy. They let her do this to me. I stood up and told them that I didn't come here to reconcile, but to deliver a message. I was done being the scapegoat. They begged me to calm down. My mom started crying about her heart condition, saying the stress might kill her. I felt a flicker of guilt, but the anger was stronger. I left the table right then and walked out. I stayed away for several weeks after that. My phone blew up with messages from my dad asking if I'd come visit my mom, reminding me she was fragile. Kayla even tried emailing me, but I never responded. I had too much bitterness bottled up. Meanwhile, I was nearing graduation. The plan was to move to a different city and start a new job. Through a career fair, I landed a position at a promising startup. It felt like a big step toward leaving my past behind. Part of me wanted to cut off my family and never look back. But as the weeks went by, I heard from extended relatives. My aunt called, saying my mom's condition was worsening. She pleaded with me to at least make peace before moving. I felt torn. Despite everything, she was still my mother, and she was dying. Could I live with myself if I just walked away? After agonizing over it, I decided to visit once more, on my own terms. I wouldn't be manipulated, though. I went to the house, found my mom alone in the living room, and told her we needed to talk without anyone else interrupting ever again. She was pale, breathing heavily, and I could see the toll this illness was taking on her. But I didn't budge. I told her how alone I'd felt, how they'd never given me a chance to defend myself. I demanded to know if she truly believed I was some sort of criminal. She shook her head, tears in her eyes, saying she'd been overwhelmed by Kayla's evidence. I asked her why she never reached out in the years since, and she just sobbed that she was too ashamed. It was pathetic. I felt no sympathy, only an absolute cold resolve. I spelled out what I wanted, an acknowledgement from them that Kayla lied, and a written apology they would share with the relatives who believed I was a junkie. My mom nodded weakly, saying she would do whatever it took. I told her to rest, that I would wait for it in writing. Then I left. I didn't see my dad or Kayla on the way out, which was fine by me. I drove away feeling a mix of triumph and bitterness. I knew I might never truly forgive them, but at least they'd have to set the record straight. A week later, I received a typed letter signed by both of my parents. It stated that Kayla had fabricated the entire story about me selling drugs. They apologized and asked all extended family to forgive them for their mistake. They mailed copies to my aunts, uncles, and grandparents. I felt a grim satisfaction reading those words. It wouldn't erase what happened, but it was a start. I didn't speak to Kayla again. She sent me a text saying she was sorry, that she regretted her actions, and she wanted to rebuild our relationship. I immediately deleted it without replying. As for my mom, I learned that her condition was indeed dire. She might need a transplant soon. My dad kept calling, saying mom needed emotional support, that she wanted to see me before I moved away. But I had nothing left to give. I visited her in the hospital one last time, brought her flowers, and told her I wished her no harm, but that our relationship was shattered. She cried, begging me not to leave, promising to make up for everything. I just told her long, painful, final goodbye. My heart was heavy, but my choice was made. I moved to a city several hours away and threw myself into my new job. The startup atmosphere was intense but rewarding. I learned quickly and started earning decent money. Eventually, I found a modest place to live, made some new friends, and built a life free from my family's shadow. Whenever guilt tried creeping in, I reminded myself of their deeply hurtful betrayal. I reminded myself of the lonely nights when I was homeless, the tears I shed when I realized my parents trusted a lie over me. That kept me focused on moving forward and never looking back. 2 years passed. I advanced in the company, becoming a project manager. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my aunt. My mom's health had declined severely, and she was on a waiting list for a heart transplant. My aunt said my parents wanted me to visit, even if just to say goodbye in case things went south. I felt my chest tighten, but I also felt that old anger simmering. Why should I rush to her bedside when she'd never been there for me? Still, a part of me felt I should at least check. I took a couple of days off and drove back. The hospital room felt suffocating. My dad was there, looking haggard. Kayla stood in the corner, silent as a ghost. My mom looked like she was fading away, hooked up to machines. She brightened when she saw me, but I kept my distance. My dad tried to pull me aside, begging for reconciliation, claiming my mom needed peace of mind. I told him I owed them nothing. I'd come only to see for myself if she was still alive. No, I didn't word it kindly. I was done pretending. My mother tried to speak, voice trembling. She said she wanted my forgiveness, that her final wish was to see me reunited with the family. Kayla tried to chime in, but I silenced her with a glare. I told my mom that she'd lost the right to ask that of me. I reminded her of the years I spent struggling, the accusations that nearly ruined my future. I told her I had no intention of rejoining their family circle. My dad started shouting, calling me ungrateful and cruel. I told him he was reaping what he'd sown all these years. Her health deteriorated rapidly after that. My aunt kept me updated. I refused to visit again. Some might call that heartless, but I saw it as the outcome they created. The damage was done long before her illness. She passed away a month later. My dad left me voicemails, calling me every name under the sun, blaming me for her death. I blocked his number. I had tried to be civil. They wanted me to pretend the past never happened. I couldn't. I wouldn't. The funeral came and went, and I didn't attend. They had made their bed long ago. To my shock, after her death, Kayla reached out again. She sent a long email saying she didn't expect me to forgive her, but she wanted to let me know she was miserable and filled with regret. She said our dad had turned cold toward her too, blaming her for my estrangement. She claimed she hadn't realized the full consequences of her lie until now. She ended by asking if we could at least talk. I stared at that message, remembering every single hurt she caused. I deleted the email. Revenge. Sometimes is just letting them suffer completely in silence. Over time, my life flourished. I got promoted again, purchased a small condo, and traveled with friends. I occasionally saw updates about Kayla. She struggled to find stable work, apparently overshadowed by her own reputation for lying and manipulative behavior. My dad fell into debt, possibly from medical bills. None of it bothered me. In fact, it felt like poetic justice. They had each other, but they'd destroyed their own unity long ago. I found love with someone who valued my worth, and we built a supportive relationship. I no longer felt that gnawing emptiness I once so deeply carried. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if Kayla hadn't lied, if my parents had believed me, if they'd given me a chance. But dwelling on that changes nothing. My life now is the product of my own resilience, and I'm proud of it. I won't deny the bitterness still lingers in some corners of my heart, yet it fuels me, reminds me that I can stand on my own. People often ask if I regret not reconciling before my mom passed. Honestly, no. She made her choice when she fully believed Kayla's lie over her own child. Now, my dad sometimes sends letters, each filled with guilt-tripping and accusations. He claims I'm selfish for ignoring family obligations. But family is more than blood. Family is trust, loyalty, and compassion. They showed me none of that when I was 17, desperate and alone. Kayla, from what I hear, still tries to contact me occasionally, but I've moved on. I have my own circle of loved ones. I won't let their pleas pull me back into a toxic cycle. They had their chances to be a family. They blew it. I chose myself, and I've never, ever regretted it. That's my story. No neat bow at the end. No miracle reconciliation. I survived their betrayal, built my own life, and refused to let them leech off my success or my emotions. My mom is gone, and I never got closure, but honestly, I'm at peace with that. My dad and Kayla can live with the consequences of their lies and cruelty. I don't owe them forgiveness, and I won't pretend otherwise. Sometimes cutting ties is the only way to heal. If they wanted a different outcome, they should have considered the cost before discarding me like trash in cold blood. I was a senior in high school when my cousin Liz made the accusation that destroyed my life forever. We'd grown up almost like siblings, spending weekends at each other's houses and trading jokes, secrets, and teenage frustrations. Our family seemed close-knit, organizing big holiday gatherings and potluck dinners with unspoken but unbreakable bonds. I never thought that intimacy could turn on me. At 17, I held a precious college acceptance letter and a tuition fund from my grandparents' trust. My parents used to call me the family's chance to break the old curse of never graduating from a prestigious university. Liz's accusation shifted everything in a heartbeat. She told them I'd assaulted her one night after a party. She cried, insisting she'd stayed silent out of fear. Nobody questioned her story. I remember the way my father's face darkened, rage flooding his eyes. I recall him saying, "You are no son of mine." He canceled my college fund, kicked me out, and told me to never return. My mother sobbed but refused to look at me. My grandparents didn't even call. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. One moment, I was the family's pride. The next, a living disgrace tossed aside without a shred of mercy or doubt. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch, clutching a single duffel bag containing my clothes and an old laptop. Everything felt unreal. Liz's story spread through my extended family like wildfire, painting me as a monster who preyed on his own cousin. Nobody bothered to ask for evidence or a detailed timeline. The shame was suffocating, and I could hardly show my face in public. I tried calling my parents to speak calmly, to explain that nothing happened, but their anger drowned out my words. My father claimed I'd broken his trust beyond repair. He screamed that I'd never be welcomed under his roof again. With my college funds revoked, I had no path forward. Scholarships were limited, and applications had closed long ago. I took a job at a hardware store, saving what little I could. Meanwhile, Liz went on with her life, basking in sympathy and attention. She never once showed a hint of remorse. I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Watching her laugh at family events on social media made my blood boil. I was too numb and devastated to fight back. I shut down emotionally, focusing on surviving day by day. Nobody wanted to hear my side. I was guilty in their eyes, a lost cause with no one left to believe me. Months crawled by. I didn't have enough money to enroll anywhere, so I took whatever odd jobs I could find. My once close relatives turned their backs, refusing to return my calls or texts. My aunt and uncle even went as far as blocking me on every possible platform. That was Liz's doing. She had them convinced I was dangerous. My friends' parents looked at me with pity but never asked me to leave. I could see the unease though, and it stung like hell. Every time I saw news about classmates heading to college, my chest tightened. I had dreams of standing on campus lawns, free and excited about my future. Instead, I was stocking shelves, cleaning bathrooms, and barely scraping together enough for gas. The injustice ate at me daily, but I felt powerless. Liz enjoyed her victory, though I had no idea why she did it. I had never hurt her, never laid a hand on her in any inappropriate way, but nobody cared. The tension in my mind spiraled into resentment, a burning fury that filled my thoughts. Still, I kept my head down. I had no choice but to adapt. My reality was bleak, and anger alone wouldn't fix it. Survival became my sole priority, forcing me to bury my hatred beneath layers of pain. Everything changed a few years later when I got a surprising call from my grandmother. She sounded hesitant, as though unsure if I would even pick up. She said Liz was gravely ill, diagnosed with an aggressive cancer. Doctors gave her a limited time to live, and the family had rallied around her for support. By then, I had moved into a tiny studio apartment, working 2 jobs to pay bills and occasionally taking online classes in hopes of salvaging my education. The moment my grandmother mentioned Liz, my body tensed. The resentment I had buried resurfaced in a hot flash of rage. She told me Liz wanted to speak to me. I nearly hung up out of reflex, but found myself transfixed. Why would Liz want to see the cousin she had accused of something so vile? My grandmother pleaded, saying Liz was full of regret, that she was desperate to make things right before it was too late. I felt no obligation to oblige, but a morbid curiosity took hold. Part of me wanted to see her suffer, to confront the person who had stolen my future. I agreed to come, but only on my terms. My grandmother sounded relieved, though a lingering tension hinted that not everyone supported my visit. I decided I didn't care either way. The day I walked into Liz's hospital room, I was struck by how frail she looked. She was hooked up to machines and IV lines that snaked across her bed. She gave me a weak smile, her eyes rimmed with dark circles and her voice barely above a whisper. My parents stood awkwardly in the corner, eyes flickering with discomfort when they noticed me. My aunt and uncle were there too, their expressions inscrutable. Nobody rushed forward to hug me. They simply stepped aside, letting me approach Liz's bedside. She started by saying she was sorry, her voice trembling. She admitted she had lied, that I'd never laid a hand on her. She confessed it had all been a desperate ploy for attention, fueled by jealousy and resentment. She said she had felt overshadowed, that everyone was always praising me and ignoring her accomplishments. She wanted sympathy, to see if people would rally around her if she painted me as a villain. I felt no relief. Her tears meant nothing to me. The damage was irreparable. She reached for my hand, but I pulled back, icy fury washing over me. Everyone stared, but I refused to comfort her. She had condemned me to a living hell, and she knew exactly what she was doing all along. My mother begged me to forgive Liz, saying she was about to die and that carrying such hatred was a burden on my soul. My father stood silent, arms crossed, face tinged with regret, but not enough to offer a real apology. My aunt and uncle looked expectant, as if I should instantly absolve her. Liz managed to whisper that she wanted me to keep her secret, to tell no one of her confession. She pleaded that going public about her lie would tear the family apart and overshadow her final days. I stared at the people who had once been my entire world, now asking me to maintain the very lie that ruined my life. My father cleared his throat, muttering something about not dragging the family name through the mud. My aunt nodded, cautioning me that the truth would harm Liz's dignity in her remaining time. They seemed so certain I would comply. I felt a numbness fill me, a calm so profound it scared me. I said nothing, turned my back, and walked out of the room. As I left, I caught the panic on my mother's face. They must have sensed I wouldn't just bury the truth, not after all they had done, not after what they cost me. Forgiveness was never an option. I spent several nights grappling with rage, envisioning ways to expose Liz's confession. Part of me wanted to shout it from the hospital rooftops. I wanted the entire world to know that I was innocent, that she had maliciously fabricated her allegations. But I knew an impulsive outburst wouldn't achieve the outcome I craved. My family, especially my parents, had betrayed me. They had cut me off, discarded me like garbage, and watched me struggle without remorse. Now they expected me to lie again, to preserve their appearances for the sake of a dying woman who had never cared about my well-being. I decided I wanted more than just an apology. I wanted them to face the consequences of their actions, to feel the weight of my suffering. I looked into legal options but realized time was short and Liz's condition was deteriorating. A drawn-out lawsuit would only drain resources I didn't have. I needed something swift and final. I started collecting proof. I recorded my phone calls with my grandmother who had urged me to visit Liz. I documented every conversation, every text, building an ironclad file. If they wanted me silent, they would have to earn it. My rage simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back with brutal clarity. My biggest break came when Liz herself agreed to a private conversation with me, hoping to ease her guilt. I suggested we talk alone, no parents present. I pretended I was softening, that I might forgive her if I heard more details. She welcomed the idea, seeing it as a chance to unburden her conscience. I made sure I had a small recording device hidden in my jacket. When I walked into her hospital room, my heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. She apologized again, elaborating on how she'd orchestrated the lie. She described talking to a couple of her friends, convincing them I had cornered her after a party. She detailed how she sobbed in front of my parents, emphasizing how scared she was. She admitted she saw their wrath towards me and felt a perverse thrill at how easily they believed her. Every word etched into my memory, and the recorder captured it all. She begged me not to hate her. I stared at her hollow cheeks, listened to her ragged breathing, and felt nothing. No empathy, no sadness, just cold resolution that I would use this confession. I slipped out of the room, the weight of her betrayal heavier but strangely empowering. I had her admission, and nobody could deny it now. After I secured that recording, my mind moved to how I could maximize the fallout. Simply posting it online or blasting it on social media felt too chaotic, and I wanted a precise, targeted impact. My parents were pillars in their church community, always boasting about their devout faith. Liz's parents were similarly revered. Everyone viewed them as pious figures upholding moral values. So I made a plan to send the recordings to selected individuals, their church leaders, close family friends, even a couple of longtime neighbors who had snubbed me after Liz's accusations. I wanted them to hear the full truth, unedited. I waited until a day before Liz's scheduled discharge from the hospital. She was going to spend her final weeks at home, surrounded by family and showered with sympathy. That morning, I composed a brief email, attached the audio files, and explained how my life had been destroyed by this lie. I didn't embellish anything. I let Liz's words speak for themselves. Then I hit send. I turned off my phone and went to work, half expecting a storm of calls and messages. Part of me wondered if I'd feel guilty. Instead, I felt a strange calm, The years of anger had found an outlet, and I was ready for the consequences, whatever they might be. By the time I checked my phone during lunch break, it was overflowing with voicemails and texts. The top message was from my father, demanding I call him immediately. There were multiple missed calls from my mother, a furious text from my aunt, and even a couple of messages from extended family members who hadn't spoken to me in years. I scrolled through them, feeling an odd mix of satisfaction and anticipation. My father's tone in his voicemail was frantic, furious, and almost pleading. He said, "How could you do this to us? We're in a crisis." I played it again, letting each word soak in. This was the same man who banished me without a second thought. Now he was in panic mode because his pristine reputation and that of his precious daughter were at stake. My aunt's text threatened legal action if I didn't retract my statements, claiming Liz was too ill to cope with such stress. She conveniently forgot that her daughter's lie had cost me my entire future. I smirked at the hypocrisy. For years, they let me suffer. Now that the truth was out, they wanted to dictate the narrative. I refused to pick up any calls. I wanted them to stew in their own regret, to taste the bitterness they'd forced on me for years. That evening, I finally answered a call from my mother. She sounded like she'd been crying. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying Liz's condition was worsening and that the stress of being exposed could expedite her decline. She asked if I really wanted my cousin's last memories to be tainted by public shame. I took a long pause, remembering the lonely nights I spent working dead-end jobs, the endless self-doubt, and the future she ripped away. I asked my mother, "Where were you when I was desperate for any sign of support?" She started stammering about being confused, about how Liz's tears had felt so genuine. I cut her off. I told her I didn't owe them silence or forgiveness. She sobbed, begging me to at least issue a statement that the recordings were old or taken out of context. I refused. In that moment, I felt my final tie to my family snap. All I could recall was their betrayal and the emptiness they left me to endure. They had cast me aside without hesitation. Now they were reaping the consequences. My mother ended the call in tears. I felt a pang, but it faded quickly. This wasn't my mess. This was the truth finally being heard. I owed them nothing more than I'd already given. Within days, the fallout was massive. Church elders confronted my parents about how they'd handled the situation, expressing horror that they'd disowned me without even investigating properly. My father lost a significant leadership role he'd held there, and several of their close friends distanced themselves in disgust. My aunt and uncle faced similar backlash. Their congregation found out Liz had lied, and sympathy for her illness morphed into confusion and anger. People still pitied her cancer battle, but couldn't reconcile that pity with the harm she'd caused an innocent family member. My phone buzzed incessantly with apologies from cousins who had believed Liz. Some apologized sincerely, others just seemed worried about their own reputations. I responded sparingly, refusing to play the gracious victim. Meanwhile, Liz remained in the hospital longer than anticipated. Rumors circulated that her doctors wanted to monitor her stress levels. She wasn't doing well. My grandmother called, begging me to consider visiting Liz again, to show some mercy. I declined. She claimed Liz needed closure. My only reply was that I had closure the moment I sent those recordings. Nobody had shown me mercy when I was left homeless and hopeless. Now they wanted compassion for the dying liar. I had none left to give. That wound was irreversibly sealed. Despite my refusal to see Liz again, I did get updates from various relatives. Apparently, her condition was deteriorating faster than expected. My mother left voicemails saying that Liz regretted everything, that she prayed for my forgiveness, and hoped to make amends before the end. I listened to each message, feeling nothing but hollow indignation. I didn't doubt her fear, but remorse was worthless after years of allowing me to suffer. If she truly wanted to help, she'd have spoken up sooner. She would have saved my college fund, my reputation, and my relationships with everyone who mattered. Instead, she waited until her own mortality loomed. I found it difficult to sympathize with someone who only repented when facing death. Relatives started spinning narratives, suggesting I should find a way to make peace for my own sake. They warned I might regret not reconciling once she was gone. I saw it as another manipulation tactic. They wanted me to remain the bigger person, to mend familial ties and preserve some semblance of unity. But that unity had been shattered beyond repair. I stayed firm in my decision, blocking most calls. My revenge was already executed. I had exposed the truth. Their guilt was their own burden to carry. I was finally free of it. Liz passed away about 2 weeks after my recordings became public knowledge. She died in her sleep, surrounded by the family who had believed her lies for years. According to a cousin who texted me, Liz's final hours were spent in pain, muttering apologies, but never naming me outright. The funeral was a tense affair. I didn't go, I wasn't invited, and even if I had been, I had no desire to stand among people who had thrown me away. My parents apparently stood near Liz's casket, receiving subdued condolences from a community now aware of their betrayal. My aunt and uncle were rumored to be inconsolable, faced with the heartbreak of losing a child and the shame of her false accusations. Friends told me the mood was confusing, sadness for Liz's death, but an undercurrent of unease about the circumstances. Some reached out to me after the service, claiming they wanted to make amends. I doubted their sincerity. Even if they were genuine, it wouldn't erase the years of hell I endured. By then, I had focused on my own life. I had a stable apartment, a steady job, and was slowly rebuilding my education plans. I saw no place for them in my future. Their apology came too late, and it fell on ears that no longer cared. Months have passed since then, and I've found a semblance of peace in my life. I keep in touch with 1 or 2 relatives who believed me from the start, or at least had the decency to admit their mistake early on. As for my parents, we haven't spoken beyond a few strained texts. They still urge me to meet, to let them explain their side, but I can't find it in my heart to give them that chance. Some might call me cold, but I call it self-preservation. They let Liz's lie destroy me, turned a blind eye to my suffering, and only reached out when it affected them socially or spiritually. I won't pretend everything's fine now. My revenge was exposing the truth they fought to suppress. I don't regret it. In fact, I feel lighter. I'm finally free of the crushing guilt they forced onto my shoulders. Liz is gone, and her admission stands as proof that I was never the villain. They'll have to live with the fallout, the shattered reputation, and the knowledge that they lost the son they once claimed to love. I don't lose sleep over it. I'm moving forward without them, determined to build a life on my own terms. They may beg for forgiveness, but it's a door I'll never open. I'm posting this under a throwaway account because I never want my family to find me. From my earliest memory, I sensed my mother hated the fact that I was born a girl. She never outright struck me, but she made sure I knew how inconvenient my existence was. Every time I showed her something from school, a drawing, a story I wrote, even a test I aced, she'd pick it apart and find the flaws. My father tried to smooth things over when he was still around, saying she was just under a lot of stress, but I noticed he never forced her to stop. He was always stuck in this limbo of hoping she'd change without actually confronting her. Then, when I was 10, he left. No warm goodbye, no custody battle. He left me a short note saying he was sorry, and then he disappeared. My mother's reaction was chilling. She informed me he'd left both of us, as though we were 2 items on a curb. She didn't cry or seem sad, she just gave me this look of condescending triumph, like she'd won. After that, life became a dreary series of routines. I cooked for myself unless she decided to make something she knew I despised. I washed my own clothes, walked to school alone, and came home to find her either out on dates or silently watching TV. If I asked for money to buy school supplies, she acted as though I were draining her life savings. She'd make me wait days before grudgingly handing me a few bills, telling me to be grateful she bothered at all. I remember when I was 11, my class was going on a field trip, and the cost was minimal. She refused to pay. When I pleaded with her, explaining that all my friends would be going, she sniffed and said, "Sounds like you need new friends." That's when I realized she took a twisted pleasure in denying me normal childhood experiences. I tried to convince myself that it was some misguided attempt to teach me independence, but I gradually saw the truth. She didn't want me around, period. When I was 14, she started dating Alan, a man with a 12-year-old son named Tyler. At first, I didn't mind. Alan was nice enough. He asked me generic questions about school, actually listened for 10 seconds, then drifted back to whatever he and my mother were discussing. Tyler was polite at first, a little shy. I thought maybe we could get along. But then, my mother turned every interaction into a show of how wonderful Tyler was. I'd walk into the living room and see them giggling over some video. The second she noticed me, her face would stiffen. She'd send me to fetch something or tell me to tidy up. Tyler rarely made eye contact with me after that. Over time, it became obvious that she was lavishing all the affection she'd denied me onto Tyler. She took him shopping for sports gear, bragged about his soccer skills to every neighbor, and posted dozens of photos of them grinning side by side. I was not in a single photo. Even Alan seemed slightly uncomfortable, but he never said anything to discourage her. When Tyler moved in, I found my posters in the trash. My mother said, "They're childish," then replaced them with Tyler's trophies and his team pictures. She painted his room in bright colors, calling it our new family project. Meanwhile, my room remained the same drab space I'd always had, except now it often served as storage for boxes of Tyler's off-season gear. I tried to keep the peace. If I didn't speak much, I reasoned, she'd have no ammunition. I focused on my schoolwork, hoping my grades would get me a scholarship somewhere far away. My mother seemed happy to ignore me, except to demand chores or wave off any question I had about dinner. I ate whatever scraps I could find if she bothered to cook, usually the meals Tyler disliked. One evening, I noticed something off about my plate of spaghetti. A strange, bitter aftertaste lingered in my mouth and my stomach cramped a few hours later. My mother stood by the sink, watching me with a smug smile. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Maybe the sauce had gone bad. But I couldn't forget that look on her face. It was too satisfied. Over the next few weeks, I caught her smirking whenever I ate something she prepared. Often, I'd feel queasy later, but never enough to go to the hospital. Suspicion gnawed at me. Could she really be tampering with my food? I decided to set up a small camera. It was cheap, not the best quality, but I hid it on top of a cabinet in the kitchen, angled just right to capture the counter where she usually prepped meals. I labeled my leftovers and told her I planned to eat them the next day, making sure they were in a distinct container. Then I went to hang out at a friend's place for a few hours. Later that night, with my heart hammering, I checked the footage. She walked into the kitchen, glanced around, and took my container out of the fridge. She opened it, rummaged under the sink, then sprinkled something into my food. The camera wasn't high definition, but it clearly showed her holding a little container of powdered cleaner we kept for scrubbing the stove. She stirred it into my leftovers. Then, unbelievably, she put the container back, sealed it, and gave a little sneer as she closed the fridge. My blood ran cold. All these years of her passive-aggressive digs and cold demeanor were nothing compared to this. She was literally poisoning me. The next day, I faked eating those leftovers and tossed them out in a public bin far from home. For a while, I felt numb, not sure what to do. Going to the police immediately sounded logical, but I was still a minor, and I'd heard horror stories about the foster care system. Plus, I worried nobody would believe me, or she'd claim I fabricated the footage. So I resolved to gather more evidence. I bought a few small cameras online, stashed them around the kitchen and living room, and even started recording audio of her snide remarks. My mother continued her campaign, tampering with any food she thought I'd eat. She sometimes made sly comments to Tyler, who would giggle but never confront her. Alan seemed blissfully ignorant, though I suspected he was just relieved she wasn't making his life difficult. When I turned 16, my mother's hostility escalated. She openly criticized me in front of Alan, calling me a dead weight who contributed nothing. He'd sometimes glance at me apologetically, but he never defended me. She started restricting what groceries I could access, labeling things as Tyler's so I wouldn't dare touch them. I got a part-time job walking dogs and babysitting just to buy my own necessities. With every small pay I received, I put a little aside. I wanted a safety net for the day I could finally leave. That safety net grew slowly, but so did my collection of evidence. I caught her sprinkling powders, liquids, even small crushed pills into my meals. Fortunately, I'd gotten good at pretending to eat. I'd either flush it down the toilet or quietly discard it outside. I documented everything, saving the footage on multiple USB drives and an online backup. It was horrifying to rewatch these clips, seeing my mother's face twist with satisfaction as she attempted to harm me. But it hardened my resolve. I would not confront her prematurely. I had to wait until I was sure she couldn't weasel out of punishment. Meanwhile, she basked in playing doting mother to Tyler, bringing him new clothes and gadgets, celebrating every trivial milestone in his life. He reveled in her attention, shooting me smug looks whenever she praised him for something simple. Their little alliance sickened me, but I kept my head down. I sometimes fantasized about revenge, about watching her pay for the horrible things she'd done. Yet, I also had to be practical. If I left before graduation, I'd jeopardize my schooling and any chance of scholarships. When I was 17, I secretly met with a teacher I trusted. I showed her a short clip of my mother tampering with my food. The teacher was horrified and helped me contact a lawyer who specialized in minors dealing with abuse. He advised that, while I could go to the authorities now, my mother might spin it as a rebellious teen forging videos. We decided to keep collecting irrefutable evidence. My 18th birthday was less than a year away. If I could hold out until then, I'd have more legal standing to press charges as an adult, and she wouldn't be able to manipulate me further. During that final year, my mother's bitterness intensified. Alan still remained mostly on the sidelines, but he occasionally complained that things felt tense. She'd wave him off or blame me, saying I was difficult to handle. Tyler was enjoying his teenage years, oblivious or indifferent to my suffering. Sometimes, I'd see him rummaging in my room without permission, likely trying to find anything he could use against me, or amuse himself by violating my privacy. I started locking my door when I wasn't home, but my mother would override my lock if she felt like it. I continued to gather recordings, both video and audio. I documented verbal tirades where she called me worthless and implied that I should just leave if you hate it here so much. Once, I overheard her telling Tyler she wished she'd never had a daughter, that her life would have been easier. Tyler laughed, and I realized he'd become her co-conspirator, happy to watch me suffer as long as it kept him in her good graces. Finally, the day I graduated high school arrived. My mother and Tyler didn't come to the ceremony. Alan showed up briefly but left right after I got my diploma. I wasn't disappointed. Their absence only confirmed what I'd known all along. Instead, I focused on my plan. I had a small storage unit where I'd been moving my belongings a bit at a time. That evening, I packed up the last of my essential items, including my hidden cameras and USB drives. My mother ambled into the living room, suspicious but not alarmed. She probably assumed I was bluffing whenever I talked about leaving. I told her plainly, "I'm moving out." She wore a mocking half-smile as if to say, "Good riddance." Tyler hung back, arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen. That's when I brought up the videos. Her expression faltered for a moment, then she scoffed, claiming I was making things up. I pulled out my phone and showed her a single clip of her sprinkling powder into my food. Her face went white. Tyler's eyes bulged. Alan, who just walked in, demanded to know what was going on. I calmly explained I had months of footage of her attempting to poison me, plus diaries she'd written long ago stating how she regretted ever having a daughter. She lunged at me, shrieking that I was a liar. Alan had to hold her back. Tyler shouted something about how I was ruining everything. I informed them all that I'd already backed up the videos and sent copies to my lawyer. If she tried to contact me again, or if Tyler tried any intimidation, I'd go straight to the police. Then I walked out the door, leaving them in stunned silence. I moved into a tiny, rundown apartment, but it was mine. I got a second part-time job, scraping by on cheap groceries and hardly any furniture. It didn't matter. I could breathe. I wasn't constantly checking my food for poison. I started therapy, trying to unpack the years of psychological damage. My therapist was the one who really encouraged me not to wait any longer to press charges. She said, "This isn't just about you. What if she does this to someone else?" On my 18th birthday, I walked into a police station with my lawyer. We handed over everything: the camera footage, the diaries, screenshots of her texts threatening me after I left. The police seemed shocked but took it seriously. Child endangerment, attempted poisoning, assault. They rattled off potential charges. My mother was taken in for questioning. She claimed I'd doctored the videos. Then they showed her the diaries and made her listen to the audio recordings of her laughing about tainting my food. She couldn't worm her way out of that. Tyler was questioned too. He was flustered, contradicting himself, trying to shield his mother. Alan claimed ignorance, which might have been partially true, but the investigators weren't thrilled with how little he'd noticed. The case moved forward quickly, given how explicit the evidence was. My mother made bail thanks to Alan, but when the preliminary hearing came, the prosecution presented enough to ensure this was heading to trial. My mother's lawyer tried the angle that she wasn't in her right mind, that it was a stress-induced breakdown. The prosecutor dismantled that excuse by pointing out the repeated, methodical nature of her actions supported by camera footage. She wasn't lashing out once or twice. She was doing this regularly, with planning and intent. Tyler wasn't charged with anything criminal, but his role as an onlooker who sometimes egged her on was noted. Alan tried to plead with me, saying Tyler's future would be ruined if I kept going. I told him that Tyler's future was not my concern after he stood by and watched his mother poison me. Alan didn't have a reply to that. At the trial, I sat on the witness stand, describing the fear I lived with. I explained how she'd poisoned my meals, how I had the presence of mind to avoid ingesting too much once I caught on. The prosecution showed clip after clip, each worse than the last. My mother giggling, making nasty remarks about how I might lose weight or learn a lesson. The defense tried to argue lack of harmful intent, but that crumbled under the sheer volume of evidence. Lab tests on the substances confirmed they were harmful chemicals, entirely unfit for consumption. In one instance, the powder could cause serious internal damage if taken in large quantities. When the guilty verdict came, I felt something break inside me, a final release. The judge pronounced her guilty on multiple counts, including child endangerment and attempted assault. She was sentenced to several years in prison. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was enough to ensure she'd carry that label forever. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I ever had, with no intention of offering her any mercy or forgiveness. She'd tried to rid herself of me, and she failed. Now she was the one banished from normal life. Alan didn't speak to me after the trial. I heard through old neighbors that he divorced her and moved away with Tyler. Maybe they couldn't stand the shame, or maybe he finally realized the kind of person he'd been living with. Either way, I didn't care. My mother's new perfect family was in ruins. She'd orchestrated her own downfall by pushing me too far, forgetting that I had more resilience and intelligence than she ever gave me credit for. The diaries that once spelled out her hatred for me became key pieces of evidence, sealing her fate. Some people who hear my story ask if I ever consider reconciliation. They assume I might soften over time, especially since she's my mother. But I refuse. She tried to poison me, laughed as I ate tainted food. There's no forgiveness in my heart for someone who intentionally harmed me and took pleasure in it. My revenge was thorough and final, seeing her in handcuffs, forced to face the truth in a courtroom, and then thrown behind bars. I owe her nothing. I won't visit her in prison. I won't write letters. As far as I'm concerned, she ceased to exist in my life the day the judge delivered the verdict. I've moved on. I'm in college now, thanks to scholarships I worked hard to earn. It's a tough balancing act with finances, but I take pride in my independence. No one can dictate what I eat or what I wear. I have a small circle of friends who know bits of my past. They're supportive and never push me to talk about it more than I want to. Therapy has been my safe space to dissect the trauma, but my main focus is building a future that's entirely mine. I dream of having a career that gives me stability, maybe even starting a family on my own terms one day, if I decide I want one. Sometimes I still have nightmares about her standing over my shoulder, whispering that I'm worthless. But then I wake up and remember that she's locked away, that the system she tried so hard to manipulate turned against her once the evidence came to light. Those nightmares grow less frequent with time. Instead of her voice, I hear my own, reminding me of what I overcame. In moments of reflection, I think back to the first time I realized something was deeply wrong with our relationship. I was 6, holding up a picture I'd drawn, hoping for just a smile. She gave me the most forced, tight-lipped grin and said, "Why are the arms so long?" That tiny moment crystallized years later into the certainty that she would never love me. I've accepted that fact. She picked the wrong person to underestimate. She might have destroyed me if she'd been a bit subtler or if I'd been more naive, but I was done letting her walk all over me the second I tasted that bitter tang in my food and saw her smirk. People often say the best revenge is living well. In my case, the best revenge was also ensuring she faced real consequences. I don't regret a single step I took to collect and preserve evidence. I don't regret pressing charges. If I could rewind time, I'd do it all again. Let her rot. She never wanted me in her life, and now she gets to live without me, in a cell where she can't hurt anyone else. I've blocked any attempts at contact from her. She sent me letters at first, alternating between furious threats and hollow pleas. I handed them directly to my lawyer, adding them to the growing stack of evidence. She tried calling, and I changed my number. When she's eventually released, I hope she understands there's nothing left between us. I've carved out my own identity, separate from her twisted world. My father never stepped in to rescue me, and she used that abandonment as a weapon for years. It's ironic that she ended up abandoned herself by Alan and Tyler, by neighbors who once admired her superficial charm, and most importantly, by the daughter she despised. I might never fully heal from what happened, but each day I distance myself further from the person she tried to break. I'm proud of who I'm becoming, someone who refused to be silent in the face of evil. She taught me one lesson inadvertently, to never let anyone dictate my worth. If there's any shred of gratitude I might have, it's that I learned early on how to survive. So, that's the story. My mother loathed having a daughter so much that she tried to push me out of her precious new family and even tampered with my food to accomplish it. She smirked as I swallowed who knows what. But in the end, I got the last laugh. She sits in prison, stripped of her maternal facade, and I'm here, rebuilding my life. There's no forgiveness. I'm not interested in cathartic closure with hugs and tears. Revenge was the only fitting resolution, and trust me, it was extremely satisfying to watch her face justice. If she ever wonders why I didn't just disappear quietly, maybe she'll recall that day in the courtroom when I stood up and told the whole truth. That's the day she lost everything she pretended to hold dear. I'm sharing my story because people sometimes assume mother knows best. In my case, my mother knew exactly what she was doing, and it was malicious to the core. If anyone reading this is going through something similar, know that you're not crazy for suspecting foul play. Document everything. Tell someone you trust. You don't have to forgive atrocities committed against you, especially by someone who's supposed to protect you. Sometimes, the only closure is to see justice served. I live free now, free from her smirks, her sabotage, her relentless disdain. I don't worry about whether she approves of my clothes or scoffs at my dreams. I don't flinch at every creak in the house, wondering if she's lurking. And I don't have to eat anything with hidden poison. That alone is worth every moment I spent planning her downfall, because that's exactly what I did. I took all her hatred, gathered proof of it, and turned it into the weapon that sent her to prison. I guess a part of me wishes things had been different. If she'd loved me, if my father had stayed, if we could have been a normal family. But wishing changes nothing. Action did. My final act was refusing to let her get away with attempted murder. I hope that's a clear enough message. She wrote me off as a burden, tried to dispose of me, and failed. I walked out stronger than ever. So, while I'll never have the kind of childhood some people take for granted, I've built a future that's entirely mine. That's the greatest revenge I could possibly ask for. I grew up in a tight-knit religious community in the Midwest, the kind where everyone knows each other's business and devout obedience is the bedrock of faith. My parents were pillars of this congregation. My father led prayer sessions, and my mother taught Sunday school. From an early age, I was taught that questioning their authority was sinful, so I never did. I followed every rule, wore every modest dress, and recited every verse with careful devotion. My father hammered into my head that my duty was to become a good wife and mother, as though I existed solely for that purpose. His eyes brimmed with disapproval any time I displayed a trace of individuality. Over time, I felt my own identity slipping, replaced by someone who lived in constant fear of making a misstep. The older I got, the heavier that burden became, until I almost couldn't breathe. I was taught that my parents' word was final, and no deviation would be tolerated. When I was 16, my father threatened to break off my friendship with a neighbor's daughter simply because I asked about applying to a local community college. He told me I needed to focus on my real purpose, become a wife. The older I got, the more intense his demands became. By 19, they were pushing me to court a family friend, a man almost twice my age. They called it a blessed union, but I saw it as a prison sentence. He was the kind of man who rarely looked me in the eye, always spoke over me, and never seemed interested in anything beyond ensuring I'd be a compliant spouse. My mother supported all of it, convinced this was the best way to safeguard my soul. I felt trapped and hopeless. Around that time, I discovered a hidden stash of old textbooks in the attic. My mother's younger sister had left them behind years ago when she distanced herself from the family. Though we rarely spoke about my aunt, I'd overheard bits and pieces. She was the black sheep. She got into arguments with my father about everything from theology to women's rights, and eventually she packed up and left. Those textbooks were my first glimpse of a world outside my parents' narrow teachings. I devoured chapters on biology, world history, and literature in secret. By the time I turned 20, I knew I couldn't remain under my parents' roof for long. My aunt's example haunted me. If she could escape, maybe I could too. But I had no money and no idea how to start. My parents controlled every aspect of my life, from finances to social contact. I started babysitting for families within our community, hoping to earn a little cash. My father insisted I hand over the payments for household expenses, so I pretended to comply, slipping a few bills aside before giving the rest. It took months, but eventually I saved a modest sum. I was terrified of being caught. One night, I overheard my parents talking about finalizing the engagement with that family friend. My heart pounded as they said I'd be a bride by the following spring. Panic set in. I knew time was running out. Through an ancient computer in the church's youth room, I researched every place I could go where my parents might not find me. My mother had once mentioned missionaries in Kenya, so my search led me to a volunteer program in Nairobi. I applied, telling them I was desperate for a fresh start. They responded weeks later with an acceptance email. I almost fainted seeing those words on the screen. There was a small stipend and housing in a shared dorm, but I needed a plane ticket and enough money to cover living costs until my first payment. My stash wasn't enough, so I sold a gold necklace my grandmother had given me. It broke my heart to part with it, but I had no choice. Then I forged my father's signature on the passport application. I practiced it for days, terrified I'd get it wrong. When my passport arrived in the mail, I intercepted it before my parents could. Every step felt like a gamble. If they discovered my plans, I knew they'd lock me in the house until the wedding. Sometimes I wondered if leaving would be worth the risk, but my fear of staying was stronger. I finally slipped out one early morning when my parents believed I was heading to a church event. I had a small suitcase, my savings, and my passport tucked inside my coat. Getting on that plane still feels like a dream. My stomach churned the entire flight, and my nerves only intensified when I arrived in Nairobi. The volunteer group had arranged for a driver to pick me up, and he was a friendly Kenyan man with a warm smile who introduced himself as Peter. I'd never experienced such open kindness from a stranger. He helped me get situated in the shared dorm, which was a simple but welcoming place with a handful of other volunteers from different countries. I was homesick at first, but I also felt liberated in a way I'd never known before. Nobody was hovering over me, dictating my every move. The work itself involved assisting with educational programs for children in underprivileged areas. I found myself reading with groups of kids who barely had enough textbooks, and I helped organize art activities. The staff, including several locals, were patient with me as I adjusted to life in a new country. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that anything was better than becoming that man's subservient wife back home. Slowly, I built friendships with the other volunteers, especially a woman named Yasmin from France and a British man named Daniel. We bonded over evening meals, sharing stories about our lives. They found my background shocking. Yasmin insisted I was brave for running away, while Daniel said I was proof that even the most rigid situations had escape routes. Their support mattered to me because part of me felt shame, as if I'd betrayed my family's expectations. One evening, after a particularly rewarding day with the kids, I checked my phone and discovered a barrage of missed calls from an unknown number. My stomach dropped. Then I saw the voicemails. It was my father, sounding furious and almost hysterical. He demanded I return immediately, accusing me of disgracing the family and reneging on my God-given role. He threatened to contact the authorities, though I doubted he had any actual legal grounds to force me back. Still, the fear crept in. In his messages, he insisted I would be condemned to eternal punishment if I didn't come home. My mother left a tearful message, begging me to think of their reputation. That night, I barely slept, torn between guilt and a fierce determination never to return. I saved every voicemail, every text. I wasn't sure why, but some part of me sensed I might need them. 2 months passed, and I started to find my rhythm. I explored parts of the city with Yasmin and Daniel, learned basic Swahili phrases, and felt a sense of autonomy I'd never known. Then came the day my father's threats took a new turn. He claimed he knew secrets about my lineage that would devastate me if revealed. I assumed it was just another manipulation tactic, an attempt to lure me back by fear, but something in his tone made me wonder if he was serious. The next time he called, I answered, determined to stand my ground. He told me I'd been living a lie, that I was never his daughter biologically. He said my mother had sinned with another man and he'd raised me only out of duty. Hearing that left me rattled. I wanted to scream at him for lying, but he sounded convinced. After that call, I confronted my mother via text, demanding the truth. She initially denied everything, but a week later, she sent me a long, tearful email. She admitted I'd been conceived during a brief relationship with a foreign missionary who visited our church. My father found out when I was just a toddler. For years, they covered it up to keep appearances within the community. She also dropped another bombshell. The missionary was Kenyan, which she assumed was the reason I'd run to Africa, as if something drew me there subconsciously. I felt numb reading those words. It was surreal, learning my real father might be walking around somewhere in the same country I'd escaped to. Part of me wanted to search for him, to see if he even knew about me. Another part felt furious at the lies. My father's hypocrisy was unimaginable. In the days that followed, I was paralyzed with conflicting emotions. Yasmin and Daniel urged me to seek counseling. With their help, I connected to a local therapist who specialized in cross-cultural issues. Unpacking the realization that the man I'd called Dad all my life wasn't actually related to me was both shocking and, in some strange way, freeing. It explained why he treated me so harshly compared to my younger brothers. It also confirmed that his insistence on marrying me off was less about love or faith and more about getting rid of a constant reminder of my mother's sin. That realization ignited a new resolve in me. I decided I wasn't done fighting. He wanted me to stay quiet, to slip back and let him maintain his facade. But I'd learned from the voicemails and threats that he feared public embarrassment above all. I reached out to an old friend who'd left our congregation a few years earlier. She still lived in the same town and had connections with community members who were unhappy with my father's authoritarian rule. With her guidance, I drafted an anonymous letter detailing the abuse, the forced courtship, and the truth about my paternity. I included snippets of his voicemails, carefully transcribed, where he threatened me. My friend circulated these letters among several families in the church, slipping them into mailboxes under the cover of night. It was a bold move, but I wanted to expose him for the hypocrite he was. My father had used the pulpit to shame other congregants for lesser sins, all while concealing the fact that he'd built his entire family on a lie. The fallout was immediate. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the church started asking questions. My father's reputation took a hit, but he doubled down, calling me a tool of the devil. He gave a sermon in which he described me as an ungrateful daughter corrupted by worldly influences. He denied everything, labeling the letters as forgeries. That's when I decided to release audio clips of his voicemails. My friend posted them online, tagging various community members and even a few local journalists. In those recordings, his rage was on full display, complete with biblical curses and threats to have me brought back in chains. Once the audio leaked, some of his staunchest supporters started to waver. People realized he was capable of cruelty behind closed doors. Church elders confronted him. Some demanded he step down from leadership. Others tried to defend him, but the damage was undeniable. My mother's silence added fuel to the fire, making people suspect the worst. Back in Nairobi, I received countless messages from church acquaintances, some offering support, others spewing the same old judgmental rhetoric. I felt a surge of empowerment. Everything he'd tried to bury was finally coming to light. Meanwhile, I focused on my volunteer work and tried to find any lead on my biological father. My mother offered scant details, claiming she didn't know much beyond his first name and the fact that he'd volunteered with an international organization decades ago. It felt like a long shot, but I approached a few local mission groups, hoping someone might remember a Kenyan who served in the US around the time I was conceived. Most had no records that far back, yet I refused to give up. If he was still alive, I believed I had the right to at least meet him once. That desire fueled me forward. My revenge against my father wasn't complete. A few months after the letters and audio clips went public, I learned he was still preaching, though attendance had dropped. He was also pressuring my mother to disown me entirely. I decided to strike again, this time with a more personal blow. I knew from experience that our congregation valued financial integrity almost as much as religious piety. With help from my friend, I got hold of a partial financial report from the church. We highlighted suspicious expenses that hinted at misuse of funds. My father had been channeling donations into his personal bank account. We compiled the evidence and sent it to the church's board and a local newspaper. The scandal that followed dwarfed the earlier drama. Accusations flew, and some members threatened legal action. My father's world of moral superiority began crumbling even more. Meanwhile, I kept searching for my biological father. As luck would have it, a local pastor named Samuel heard about my story through the volunteer network. He remembered an older Kenyan gentleman who'd gone to the US for a mission trip about 24 years ago. Samuel helped me track down a retired teacher named Lucas. The moment I met Lucas, I felt an odd sense of calm. He had kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. We talked for hours. He admitted he'd once volunteered in the Midwest, but he swore he knew nothing about a child. He'd had a brief relationship with a woman there, but it ended before he returned to Kenya. We decided to do a DNA test, though I tried not to get my hopes up. Weeks later, the results confirmed he was my father. Both of us just sat there, stunned. He cried quietly, apologizing for never knowing I existed. He told me he'd have made different choices if he'd known. I believed him. Lucas wasn't some saint, but he seemed honest, a stark contrast to the man who'd raised me under intimidation and lies. He asked me endless questions about my life, and we bonded over little things like our shared interest in reading. Meeting him gave me a feeling of closure, yet it also opened a door to a world I'd never anticipated. He introduced me to some of his relatives, who welcomed me with open arms. They didn't judge me for my past. Instead, they marveled at how I'd managed to find my way here. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere without pretense or shame. It was everything my upbringing lacked. I felt both exhilarated and a little sad. Although I felt more at peace, I couldn't ignore what was happening back home. My father was under investigation for embezzlement of church funds, and certain authorities were looking into whether he'd coerced minors into arranged marriages. Some families stepped forward with disturbing stories of similar treatment. My mother tried to reach me multiple times, but I refused to answer her calls. She had enabled him for so many years, standing by in silence while he planned to marry me off. I remembered the humiliation, the threats, the suffocating fear. I realized I owed her nothing, not even a chance to explain her side. I'd given her opportunities before, and she never once stood up for me. I chose to remain distant, focusing on my new life. If that seemed heartless, so be it. I felt justified knowing what they'd all put me through. In time, the legal proceedings escalated. My father was removed from his role. My friend kept me updated on every development. The congregation was in turmoil, divided between loyalists and those who believed he had deceived them for years. Donations plummeted, lawsuits loomed. I felt a strange satisfaction knowing I'd played a part in dismantling his toxic kingdom. It wasn't a matter of pettiness. It was about ensuring he couldn't harm anyone else the way he'd harmed me. Back in Nairobi, I continued volunteering, rooming with Yasmin and Daniel, and forging a relationship with Lucas. He offered to help me pursue further education. I'd never dreamed of attending a proper university, yet here was an unexpected chance to reinvent myself entirely. My father had tried to push me into a corner to break my spirit. Instead, I found a future filled with possibilities I'd never imagined. I often think about the life I left behind. Sometimes I wonder if my mother regrets standing by him, or if my brothers resent me for upending everything. But I've come to realize that none of that truly matters. I have my own life to live now, and I won't waste another moment seeking their approval. I found a family in Lucas and his relatives, genuine friends in Yasmin and Daniel, and a sense of purpose I'd never thought possible. My father's downfall was his own doing. All I did was bring his secrets into the light. He wanted to marry me off, trap me in a cycle of submission and silence, but he failed. I have no pity for him, nor do I offer any forgiveness. He betrayed me from the start, and he deserved every ounce of justice that found him. Now, I'm saving up for university tuition and planning a future that doesn't hinge on anyone's permission. Part of me remains angry at all the years I lost, but I channel that anger into determination. If anyone reading this feels stuck in a life they didn't choose, I hope you find your path to freedom. Mine led me here, and I have no regrets. I am truly free, and that, more than anything, is the sweetest victory I could ever claim. My ex-wife, Sasha, was my high school sweetheart. We got married fresh out of graduation, fueled by youthful optimism. She was the center of my universe, and I believed we were destined for a lifetime of shared dreams. When we first tied the knot, we survived on my modest salary from a local accounting job while she worked as a secretary. Our life felt simple and sweet. I trusted her completely, never suspecting she'd betray me. But looking back, there were signs I overlooked. If I had been more vigilant, maybe I'd have seen it coming. Instead, I learned the truth too late. We were married for 6 years before everything unraveled. Sasha's boss, Marcus, was the CEO of a large firm known for his flashy lifestyle. Rumors circulated that he was a notorious womanizer. I'd heard stories of him lavishing gifts on female employees he liked, but I never worried. Sasha assured me those rumors were just idle gossip. She'd roll her eyes and say he was nothing more than a narcissistic executive who liked attention. I believed her. After all, she wore a simple wedding ring and rarely showed interest in material excess. I assumed our love was stronger than any temptation. The first time I suspected something was wrong was when Sasha began working late more often. She'd text me claiming deadlines were stacked up or that Marcus needed her assistance with important clients. Initially, I shrugged it off. She was ambitious and I admired her dedication. But then, the late nights became regular. She'd come home looking both exhausted and oddly exhilarated. Sometimes, I caught a whiff of cologne that wasn't mine. My gut churned, but I didn't want to accuse her without proof. So, I let my suspicions simmer. I told myself I was just being paranoid and insecure. Then one night, she left her phone on the kitchen table. It buzzed with a text from Marcus, reading something like, "Last night was incredible." My heart pounded. I felt nauseous, but forced myself to open the message thread. What I saw shattered me. An exchange of intimate photos and confessions of love spanning months. I couldn't breathe. When Sasha walked in and saw the phone in my hand, she froze. No explanations, no excuses. She just looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. In that moment, our entire marriage collapsed. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and too stunned to speak. Sasha broke down sobbing, swearing it was a mistake. She said she'd ended it, begged for another chance. She blamed the long work hours, stress, and claimed Marcus seduced her. I was in shock. I couldn't even form a coherent sentence. The betrayal cut deep, and every promise we'd made echoed in my head like a cruel joke. I told her to leave. She cried, pleaded, apologized, but eventually she packed a bag and walked out. That night, I didn't sleep. My thoughts spiraled, from disbelief to rage. A part of me wanted to destroy Marcus for stealing my wife. In the following weeks, Sasha insisted we try marriage counseling. She apologized constantly and promised to block Marcus. But every time I looked at her, I pictured those texts. My trust was gone. I felt sick to my stomach whenever she touched me. Eventually, I filed for divorce. She became furious, calling me weak and vengeful. She said I was throwing away our years together over a single mistake. The audacity made my blood boil. Cheating for months was not a simple slip-up. I told her I was done. I couldn't continue a marriage built on lies and betrayal. When we stood before the judge, Sasha tried to fight for alimony, claiming she couldn't maintain her lifestyle without my support. My attorney pushed back, highlighting her affair with a wealthy boss. Ultimately, the court agreed we'd just split our modest assets. We sold our tiny house, and I moved into a small apartment. Sasha, freed from our marriage, moved in with Marcus. I saw pictures on social media of them traveling, dining in upscale restaurants, and partying with influential people. Every photo felt like a slap in the face. I spiraled into depression, feeling used and discarded. At my lowest point, I learned of a massive windfall. An uncle I barely knew had passed away and left me a fortune. Apparently, he had invested in tech startups and real estate, amassing millions. I was stunned. I arranged meetings with financial advisors, cautiously optimistic about this unexpected opportunity. The irony was painful. Sasha had abandoned me for a richer man, only for me to suddenly become far wealthier. I didn't flaunt it, though. I kept working my accounting job, trying to process my new reality. Eventually, word got out through a mutual friend. That's when Sasha's texts started. The first message was short. "Hey, can we talk?" I stared at it for hours, debating whether to respond. Curiosity won out. I replied with a cold, "What do you want?" She immediately bombarded me with apologies, saying she missed me and realized she'd made a huge mistake. It was nauseating. I asked if she was still with Marcus. She hesitated, then said they were on rocky terms. She wanted to meet in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed. A part of me wanted to see her squirm. I wanted to look her in the eye and hear her excuses. Sasha arrived at the cafe looking disheveled. Gone was the polished woman I'd seen in social media photos. She looked tense, her eyes darting around like she was expecting someone to overhear. She confessed that she was pregnant. My immediate assumption was that Marcus was the father. She confirmed, then broke down. He had apparently turned cold, accusing her of trying to trap him. He wasn't giving her any financial support and questioned if the baby was truly his. She asked if I'd consider pretending to be the father to legitimize her pregnancy. My blood boiled at her audacity. I demanded to know why she thought I'd ever agree. She spewed some nonsense about how I was the better man, how she regretted leaving me. She claimed she never stopped loving me, that Marcus was a mistake. Then she dropped hints that my newfound wealth could provide a stable life for her and the baby. I nearly laughed in her face. The nerve was unbelievable. I told her I'd think about it, just to buy time. In reality, I was fuming, itching to see how low she'd go. Some part of me wanted revenge, and I saw an opportunity. Over the next few days, Sasha flooded my phone with texts. She apologized repeatedly, painting Marcus as a manipulative cheater who had used her. She insisted she'd change if I gave her another chance. I asked her to come to a counseling session with a therapist friend of mine. She agreed, desperate to prove she was sincere. During the session, she played the remorseful victim, crying about how she'd been seduced by wealth and status. She portrayed Marcus as an abusive narcissist. I listened quietly, letting her words swirl around. My therapist friend knew the backstory and took detailed notes. I acted conflicted, telling Sasha I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. She grabbed my hand and begged for forgiveness, saying she'd do anything. The next few sessions followed the same pattern. Sasha would express regret and vow loyalty, while I pretended to contemplate reconciling. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator to check if she was still seeing Marcus. Sure enough, she was staying at his penthouse, trying to coax him into accepting fatherhood. She was hedging her bets, hoping one of us would take responsibility. When the investigator showed me the pictures, my hatred for her grew. I decided to confront her during our final counseling session. I dropped the photos on the table, each depicting her leaving Marcus's penthouse. She stammered, claiming it was just a temporary arrangement until she figured out her next move. I pressed her on all the lies she'd told, the false hopes she'd dangled. She broke down, begging me to understand that she was afraid of being a single mother with no support. My therapist friend remained neutral but watched Sasha closely. I felt a surge of satisfaction seeing her tearful, panicked face. She had played a dangerous game, and it was over. Outside the session, Sasha tried one last time to convince me to take her back. She clung to my arm, sobbing about how sorry she was. I reminded her that she chose Marcus over me. She spat back that he was the father and that I was too petty to forgive. That sealed the deal. I told her to leave and never contact me again. She cried that she had nowhere to go. I told her that wasn't my problem. I walked away, letting her stand there in her despair. My only regret was that I had once loved her. A week later, Sasha showed up at my apartment unannounced, a couple of suitcases in tow. She begged for a place to stay. She was worried about her pregnancy, worried she'd end up homeless. She said Marcus had kicked her out after another argument. I refused to let her in. I told her bluntly that we were done. If she needed help, she should contact social services or her family. She wailed that she couldn't believe I'd become so cruel. I reminded her I wasn't the one who cheated. She stormed off, cursing me through her tears, slamming the door behind her. Days passed, and I heard nothing from her. I assumed she'd found another couch to crash on or return to Marcus. Then one evening, I got a call from Marcus himself, demanding that I publicly acknowledge fatherhood of Sasha's baby. He said her accusations were damaging his business reputation. She'd told people he abandoned her and refused paternity. Investors were pulling out and rumors were circulating. I laughed, reminding him that Sasha was his responsibility. He threatened legal action, which was laughable. The baby was his, not mine. I hung up, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction that karma was hitting back. Meanwhile, I began exploring business opportunities with my inheritance. I invested in a small startup and started traveling occasionally for networking. Each day felt like a new adventure, a second chance at happiness. I reconnected with old friends and even started dating again. Though my trust issues lingered, I found solace in the fact that I was free from Sasha's manipulations. I wasn't naive anymore, and I sure wasn't going to let anyone walk all over me again. Sometimes I'd think about the life we'd planned, kids, a house, maybe a dog, but the sting of betrayal reminded me to stay focused. Sasha's downfall continued. Mutual acquaintances said she hopped between cheap motels, borrowing money from anyone who'd spare a dime. Apparently, her sob stories didn't get much sympathy once people learned the real reasons she was in that mess. Marcus's company took a hit when sponsors questioned his integrity, and though he wasn't bankrupt, his empire looked shaky. I watched from a distance, determined not to get entangled in their drama. Any fleeting guilt I felt was overshadowed by the memory of their betrayal. I owed them nothing. If anything, I believed they deserved every ounce of hardship they were facing. A few months later, I received another update. Sasha had given birth to a baby boy. Rumor had it Marcus grudgingly paid for a DNA test and ended up on the hook for child support, but he refused to marry her or let her move back in. She was effectively a single mom, dealing with all the challenges alone. Someone suggested I should step in and help. I refused. I wasn't the father. I wasn't her husband anymore. I had no obligation to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. Part of me felt sad for the child, but that was it. My focus shifted to personal growth. Therapy helped me navigate the trust issues and anger still simmering inside. I started volunteering at a local shelter, partly to counter the cynicism that threatened to harden my heart. I even dated a wonderful woman for a few months. Things didn't last, but it was a healthy experience. I realized Sasha's betrayal wouldn't define my future relationships. It was a painful chapter, but it taught me resilience. Whenever I caught wind of Sasha's attempts to gain sympathy, I reminded myself that she reaped what she sowed. The betrayal was never going to be forgiven. Marcus tried reaching out again, whining that Sasha's accusations continued to tarnish his brand. He offered me money to declare I was the father. I told him he could stick his bribe where the sun doesn't shine. That seemed to enrage him, but I hung up before he could lash out. A part of me reveled in his desperation. He was finally experiencing how it felt to be manipulated by Sasha. The difference was, he deserved it. He'd lured her away with wealth, thinking he was untouchable. Now he was facing the fallout of his own arrogance. I couldn't help but smirk. Meanwhile, my startup investment began to pay off. The company secured partnerships and the product gained traction. We were on a promising path toward profitability. I treated myself to a comfortable home and made sure to maintain a low profile financially. I hadn't forgotten how quickly people could shift their loyalties for money. I was determined not to become another Marcus, flaunting wealth and attracting toxic people. My close friends celebrated my progress, acknowledging how far I'd come since the divorce. There was no trace of bitterness in my professional life. I channeled that energy into constructive pursuits. Sasha attempted a final stunt when she unexpectedly arrived at my office. Security called me, asking if they should escort her out. I was curious, so I let her up to the reception area. She looked desperate, baby in tow. She pleaded for a private word. I obliged, stepping into a small meeting room. She tried to show me pictures of the child, claiming he needed a father figure. She apologized again, tears streaming down her face. But there was no remorse for the betrayal itself, only desperation for help. She asked for money, promising she'd do anything I asked. I looked at the baby, innocent and unaware of the chaos surrounding him. Then I looked at Sasha, the woman who once held my entire heart. The sight filled me with sorrow and anger in equal measure. I told her flatly that I wasn't interested in revisiting our past or forging a new future together. She sobbed, insisting she was a changed woman. I responded that change should have happened before she ran off with her boss. I told her to leave and never return. If she needed financial support, she could go after Marcus. He was, after all, the father. Her face contorted with rage, accusing me of abandoning her at her lowest. She called me ungrateful, saying she'd shared years of her life with me. I reminded her that she'd walked away first. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. I quietly apologized to my colleagues, explaining it was a personal matter. Inside, I felt a tumult of emotions, but also a sense of closure. Sasha had tried every angle: seduction, guilt, anger, and nothing worked. She'd burned every bridge between us, and no amount of crying or begging would ever rebuild what she destroyed. In the aftermath, I found unexpected peace. I'd always feared I might weaken if I saw her in person again, especially with a baby involved. But I stood my ground. I realized my life was infinitely better without her manipulations. I no longer cried myself to sleep or woke up in cold sweats. My days were filled with purposeful work, supportive friends, and a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. I let go of the resentment, but I didn't forgive. I believed some actions are unforgivable, and Sasha's betrayal fell squarely in that category. People on social media occasionally whispered about the drama, some labeling me heartless. But those who truly knew me understood the depth of Sasha's betrayal. I ignored the gossip. My revenge wasn't about public humiliation or personal attacks. It was about living well, seizing opportunities, and denying her the chance to use me again. Marcus and Sasha both dug their own holes by lying and manipulating. Now they could suffer the consequences. I moved forward, forging relationships built on respect and honesty. Watching them flail in the toxic mess they created was more satisfying than any petty act of retaliation. As the months passed, Sasha faded from my thoughts. My startup flourished, and I found genuine happiness in simple daily routines. I explored hobbies like cooking, hiking, and eventually tried online dating again. I was careful, but I met a warm-hearted, independent woman who treated me like an equal. My past no longer defined me. Whenever I glimpsed Sasha's name in passing, I felt nothing but a slight pang of distant hurt. I owed her no forgiveness. Instead, I found a deeper sense of self-worth, knowing I had survived betrayal and emerged stronger. That was the best revenge possible. In the end, I never forgave Sasha for her disloyalty. She and Marcus paid the price for their deceit: a shattered reputation, a broken relationship, and a lifetime of regret. Meanwhile, I found not just financial security, but emotional stability. My heart is guarded, yet open to genuine love, free of lies. I see now that my loyalty was wasted on someone who valued flashy illusions over true partnership. That painful lesson shaped me into a wiser man. I'm sharing this here because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't an explosive confrontation. It's living well and refusing to be used again. I grew up believing that my adoptive mother, Nancy, had rescued me from a life of endless foster homes. She always reminded me how grateful I should be for the roof over my head, the clothes on my back, and the love she said she provided. It wasn't until I met Zach, the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, that I realized exactly how conditional that love truly was. One day before our wedding, Nancy asked me to cancel everything so Zach could marry my stepsister, Evelyn, instead. That was the final straw for me. I never saw it coming. Nancy had always favored Evelyn, her biological daughter, but I believed she still cared for me. I was her adopted child after all, even if not by blood. Evelyn was 2 years younger than me, beautiful in that effortless way that turns heads, and she thrived on attention. I had no idea she'd even been talking to Zach behind my back. But when Nancy confronted me in my living room with her bizarre demand, it all made a twisted sort of sense. They wanted me out of the picture so Evelyn could wear my ring. I felt my stomach twist into knots. All my life, I'd aimed to please Nancy, to earn her approval. I had studied hard to get into college, landed a decent job, and done everything by the book. Evelyn, on the other hand, partied her way through her teenage years, constantly demanded money from Nancy, and never once felt guilty for how she treated me. Yet, Nancy turned to me, the daughter who'd never given her trouble, and expected me to destroy my own happiness for Evelyn's sake. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone in the room could hear. I asked Nancy why, hoping I might have misunderstood. She gave me a condescending smile, the kind that flickered across her face whenever she thought I was being clueless. She said it was only right that Evelyn get her shot at a stable future, given her missteps. Apparently, it was my duty as the grateful adopted daughter to step aside. Zach, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, wouldn't meet my eyes. He didn't deny anything. He just sat there, looking guilty as sin. I felt rage surge through me, but also profound disbelief. How could they do this to me? I told Nancy that I loved Zach and refused to cancel my wedding. The next thing I knew, she was screaming at me, calling me selfish and ungrateful. She said she had invested so much in me, raised me when nobody else wanted me, and this was how I repaid her. Zach muttered something about needing time to think. Evelyn just stood there with a smug expression, as if she expected Nancy to bully me into submission. I walked out, my hands shaking, tears threatening to fall. I needed to clear my head, but I also knew I needed answers. I drove straight to my best friend Paula's place. She'd been my rock throughout the wedding planning, always the voice of reason. When I told her what Nancy had said, she looked ready to murder someone. Paula thought Nancy and Evelyn were insane and that Zach was a coward for not defending me. She asked if I wanted to walk away from Zach completely. I wasn't sure yet. I needed to confront him and hear his side, but a small voice in my head told me that my relationship with Nancy was beyond repair. Finally, at last, I'd choose myself. Zach came home later that evening. He looked uneasy, pacing around the living room like a caged animal. I asked him point blank if he had feelings for Evelyn. He hesitated, then admitted they'd shared a drunken kiss a few months back. He insisted it was a mistake and that Nancy was blowing it out of proportion. I demanded to know why he didn't stand up for me. He claimed Nancy had cornered him, told him that if he didn't cooperate, she'd cut me off financially. The funny thing was, I was financially independent, so it made no sense at all. I realized Nancy didn't just want Zach for Evelyn. She wanted to humiliate me. Perhaps she thought if she threatened Zach, he'd crumble and I'd be forced to back down. Zach swore he loved me and still wanted to marry me, but I saw doubt in his eyes. That was enough to snap me out of my confusion. I told him that if he truly loved me, he'd cut all contact with Evelyn and stand by me in front of Nancy. He hesitated again, eyes darting to the door. In that moment, I understood. He'd never fight for me, ever. Everything I'd built my life around suddenly seemed like a lie. I told Zach he had until morning to decide where he stood. Then I grabbed my purse, walked out, and drove to Paula's again. That night, I hardly slept, my mind racing with anger and heartbreak. We were set to be married the next day, and I was expected to just vanish so Evelyn could claim my future? My phone buzzed with texts from Nancy, each more manipulative than the last. I didn't open a single one. I knew whatever she said would only make me more furious still. In the morning, Zach sent me a brief text saying he'd chosen me, but only if I apologized to Nancy. That was all I needed to see. I texted him back that the wedding was off, that I refused to start my marriage under Nancy's thumb. Then I blocked his number. I contacted the venue, told them to keep the reservation for now, and asked Paula to gather a few close friends. I had no intention of letting Nancy and Evelyn off the hook. Instead of a wedding, I was going to turn that day into my stage for vengeance. First, I needed to ensure Nancy and Evelyn would show up. Nancy had spent thousands on her dress and the venue's decorations, so I knew she'd still arrive, hoping to twist everything in her favor. I told the wedding planner to confirm with Nancy that the schedule was unchanged. Then I invited Evelyn, letting her believe she'd be taking my place. In truth, I had a plan to expose both of them in front of everyone they hoped to impress. I wasn't sure Zach would show, but I figured Nancy would drag him there, if only to finalize her scheme. That morning, I arrived early. I wore a simple white dress, not the extravagant gown Nancy had pressured me to buy. Paula and our friends helped set the scene. The guests trickled in, many of them oblivious to the drama. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for confrontation. Sure enough, Nancy strutted in like she owned the place, with Evelyn clinging to her arm. Zach trailed behind, looking miserable. Before Nancy could bark orders, I walked to the front, microphone in hand. The hush that fell over the crowd made my heart pound. It was showtime, no turning back. I thanked everyone for coming, then announced that the wedding would not proceed as planned. A ripple of confusion swept through the audience. Nancy started to approach, but I lifted my hand to silence her. My voice shook, but I pressed on. I explained how, just one day prior, Nancy had demanded I call off my wedding so Evelyn could marry Zach. Gasps filled the room. Evelyn stood there, mouth open as if I'd slapped her. Nancy tried to grab the microphone, but Paula stepped forward, blocking her path. Everyone was watching, waiting for me to reveal the rest. Everything. I stated, loud and clear, that this betrayal was the reason I could no longer marry Zach. I turned to him, asking if he had something to say. He stammered, trying to apologize, but the audience was already buzzing with shock and disapproval. He confessed to a moment of weakness with Evelyn. Then, Nancy screeched that I was making a spectacle, that I was ungrateful and determined to ruin my family. I calmly pointed out that Nancy had never considered me real family. I had proof of her texts, outlining how she wanted Zach to dump me for Evelyn. Period. I projected them onto a screen, every manipulative message Nancy had sent to Zach, calling me a charity case, telling him he deserved someone from her bloodline instead. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Evelyn tried to act shocked, but I had texts from her too, bragging about how she and Zach were meant to be. Nancy lunged at me, shrieking that I was destroying the family's reputation. I stepped back, letting security, who Paula had arranged, intervene. The entire room was in chaos. Yet I felt oddly calm, as though I'd finally taken control of my life and my narrative at last. I looked Nancy in the eye and told her I owed her nothing. All my life, she'd held my adoption over my head, expecting endless gratitude. I made it clear that I would not be manipulated anymore. Then I looked at Evelyn, who was practically trembling. She tried to blurt out that Zach loved her, but Zach just hung his head. He tried to approach me, perhaps to beg forgiveness. I turned away. I wouldn't grant him that kindness. He had a chance to defend me, and he didn't. I wanted him to feel every ounce of regret and shame. With the room in disarray, I took one final opportunity to address everyone. I explained how Nancy had belittled me for years, how she'd weaponized my adoption whenever it suited her. I clarified that I was not disowning her. She'd never truly been my mother to begin with. People gawked, but I felt liberation surge within me. I declared that I would no longer be controlled by a woman who valued blood ties over love. Then I thanked those who'd supported me, apologized for the chaos, and announced that the reception would still happen for anyone who wanted to celebrate freedom. Nancy shrieked for everyone's attention, insisting that this was her venue. She demanded they all leave, but the contract was in my name, not hers. Security escorted Nancy outside, though she kept screaming about suing me, about how I owed her for my upbringing. Evelyn trailed behind, calling me every insult under the sun. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I felt numb to her venom. Zach lingered awkwardly, torn between following Nancy and trying to salvage our relationship. I left him standing there, staring after me as I invited the guests to enjoy the catering inside. Despite the drama, a surprising number of guests stayed. Paula and I turned the ruined wedding into a small celebration of independence. We ate, drank, and shared stories that had nothing to do with Nancy's manipulations. The relief in my chest grew as I realized how many people cared about me, not about Nancy's money or approval. Late in the afternoon, I caught a glimpse of Zach lurking by the entrance, eyes filled with regret. I didn't acknowledge him. My heart felt heavy, but I was resolute. He'd made his choice when he didn't stand up or properly protect me. The next day, I woke up to a flurry of missed calls. Nancy had apparently tried to spin the entire fiasco, telling relatives that I'd gone hysterical and canceled the wedding out of spite. But I'd already posted a video recording of the fiasco on social media, showing Nancy's demands and her meltdown. Public opinion quickly turned against her. Relatives who once saw me as the outsider called to offer apologies. I thanked them, but I had no intention of letting Nancy off the hook. For years, I'd bowed to her. Now she'd taste the consequences of betrayal and manipulation. First, I cut all financial ties. Nancy had used me as a co-signer on some loans for Evelyn's schooling, which Evelyn never finished. I contacted the loan officers and explained the fraud. I had no obligation to continue paying for Evelyn's irresponsible spending. Evelyn was furious, but there was nothing she could do. Nancy tried to threaten legal action, but she had no ground to stand on, especially once I shared evidence of her manipulations. Then I made sure my father's inheritance, left to me before he died, was firmly locked away from Nancy. I refused to bankroll her manipulative games anymore. Next, I confronted Evelyn directly. She had tried to blame Nancy for everything, claiming she never wanted Zach in the first place, but her messages told a different story. She begged me not to ruin her future, insisting she'd learned her lesson. I laughed at the irony. She and Nancy had tried to steal my fiancé, yet she spoke as if I owed her mercy. I warned her that if she continued harassing me or tried contacting Zach again, I'd release all her texts publicly. She sobbed, cursing me for being heartless, but I felt zero remorse for her pain. As for Zach, he showed up at my apartment 2 weeks later, begging for a second chance. He claimed Nancy had coerced him, that he'd been confused by her threats. I reminded him that he was a grown man, free to choose how he reacted. He'd chosen cowardice when I needed him to be strong. He tried to hand me a ring, saying he wanted to propose all over again, properly this time. I tossed it back, telling him I'd never trust him. The pain in his eyes was real, but so was the damage he'd done to me forever. He wrote me letters, left me voicemails, even showed up at my workplace once, begging me to hear him out. I refused. My mind was made up. I wanted him to suffer the consequences of losing me. After all the heartbreak, I chose not to forgive. My life was moving forward, and he was stuck grappling with the fallout of his weakness. Meanwhile, Nancy and Evelyn's reputations were in tatters. People who once admired Nancy's perfect family saw the truth behind her facade. Evelyn couldn't show her face without whispers trailing her. I felt absolutely no pity for them whatsoever. I stayed in contact with a handful of relatives who genuinely cared for me. They were appalled at Nancy's behavior, especially after seeing the video. Though they tried to broker peace, I refused. Nancy had treated me as less than human, and Evelyn had joined in. They deserved no reconciliation. Instead, I poured my energy into therapy, focusing on rebuilding my self-esteem. Paula and my other friends stood by me, celebrating my new chapter. I moved to a new place, one Nancy had no address for, ensuring she couldn't barge in unannounced. Finally, I began to breathe truly freely again. Occasionally, gossip reached me about Nancy and Evelyn. Rumor had it Nancy was selling the house to cover debts, while Evelyn couldn't land a steady job due to her reputation. Zach apparently tried to date Evelyn afterward, but their fling fizzled out under the weight of public scrutiny. Each rumor brought me a strange sense of satisfaction, not because I reveled in their misery, but because I felt validated. Their downfall was the result of their own choices. They'd tried to destroy me, but I'd survived and grown stronger. Now, they were the ones scrambling to pick up the pieces. I didn't stop there. With the help of a legal advisor, I ensured Nancy couldn't claim any part of my assets. I even found a small clause in the adoption paperwork that specified her financial responsibility for my welfare until I turned 18, something she'd conveniently overlooked while extorting me. Though I wouldn't pursue legal action for past grievances, it felt good to know I had a powerful defense if she tried anything else. I wanted Nancy and Evelyn to understand I wasn't weak anymore. Not anymore. The days of using my gratitude against me were over. I'd found my voice. Some people asked if I regretted exposing them so publicly, suggesting I stooped to their level. Honestly, I felt no guilt personally. They'd given me no mercy when they plotted behind my back. I refused to grant them any courtesy in return. Nancy's social standing crumbled, and Evelyn's hopes of an easy ride vanished. I didn't cheer at their downfall, I merely watched it happen. That was enough. Revenge doesn't always have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet satisfaction of seeing those who wronged you face the results of their own actions. And that was justice enough for me. I've since created a life that's truly my own. I found a new job in a different city, started volunteering at a local shelter, and made friends who know nothing of my past drama. They see me as I am, a determined, resilient person who stands up for herself. Nancy occasionally tries to contact me, usually around holidays, sending messages about forgiveness and family. I ignore them. She taught me that blood, or an adoptive claim, doesn't grant her the right to dictate my happiness. I won't allow her back in just because she regrets the consequences. My revenge is her absolute irrelevance. Some might say I should seek closure, but I disagree. I don't need their apologies or acceptance. My life has purpose without their validation. I'm sharing this because people often think forgiveness is the only path to healing. It's not. Sometimes justice is standing firm in your decision not to allow toxic people back into your life. They don't deserve your kindness. They deserve to watch you thrive without them. And that, more than anything, is the sweetest revenge I could have imagined. I owe Nancy and Evelyn nothing. I won't forgive. I won't forget. I will only live better now.